The horsemen came out of the dark on the 6th night of January, in the year 878, and the frozen ground carried the sound of them for miles before anyone in Chippenham thought to listen. Nobody listened because nobody fights in January. That was the rule, and everyone in Britain knew it. Winter was when armies went home, the roads turned to soup, the forage died, and even the Vikings, the most feared fighting men in Europe, pulled into their camps and waited for spring like everybody else. And this was not just any week of winter. This was Christmas, the 12 holy days, the one stretch of the calendar when a king could set down his sword, fill his hall with mead and firelight, and feast his nobles from Christmas Day to Twelfth night. The war was sleeping. God himself, people believed, was watching. A Viking warlord named Guthrum had done the math on all that faith, and he liked the odds. His army had slipped out of Gloucester in the dead of winter and ridden hard through the night country, and now it was pouring into a royal town where the gates stood easy and the guards were full of holiday ale. Men died in doorways wearing feast clothes. Horses screamed in the muddy lanes. And somewhere in that burning confusion, the 29-year-old King of Wessex, the last free Anglo-Saxon king left on the island of Britain, was being dragged from his bed by his own men. Because if he was still inside those walls at sunrise, everything was over. His name was Alfred. He got out with his wife, his small children, and a few dozen riders, into a January night, into the snow, with the most successful army in the known world behind him and nowhere left on earth to run. That is where England begins, in a rout. Understand the size of what had just happened, because the men riding with Alfred understood it perfectly, and it kept them silent all the way south. This was no lost battle. There had been no battle. A kingdom that had stood for 400 years had been taken in a single night, without a siege, without a field, on a holiday, by a man who simply noticed that Christian kings stopped watching the roads in December. The court was scattered, the treasury, the war gear, the food stores of the royal estate, all of it now belonged to Guthrum, and every nobleman in Wessex was waking up to the same cold arithmetic. The king was a fugitive. The Danes held the heart of the country. A man with lands and a family had two choices now: ride to Guthrum and kneel, or get his household onto a ship and pray the wind-favoured exile. The record-keepers of Alfred's own court, writing years later, put it plainly. That winter, they said, the greater part of the people submitted, and some fled over the sea. Read that line twice. His own chroniclers, men paid to make the family look good, admitted that most of Wessex gave up. Alfred did not ride to a fortress, because there was no fortress that could hold. He did not ride to an ally, because there were no allies left. He rode west and kept riding, down out of the chalk hills of Wiltshire, through a frozen, hostile week, into the one landscape in southern Britain where an army could not follow, the Somerset levels, a drowned country of reed beds and black water, of fens and willow islands, where the winter floods spread for miles in every direction, and the locals moved by flat boat along channels, no map recorded. Somewhere in the middle of it rose a low hump of dry ground called Athelney, the Isle of the Princes, a few acres of alder scrub surrounded by swamp. A man could stand on it in January and see nothing but water and grey sky. That became the royal court of Wessex, a wet island, a handful of armed men, a king, a queen, and children young enough to need carrying. They lived like outlaws because that is what they now were. They ate what the marsh gave, eels and waterfowl and winter fish, and what they could take at spear point from the estates of their own countrymen. Men who had already knelt to the Danes. Picture that raid for a second, because the humiliation of it is the whole point. The anointed king of Wessex, great-grandson of kings, crouched in the reeds at dusk, watching a farmstead, waiting to steal bread in his own kingdom. Guthrum's riders swept the country looking for him. There was a price on the information, and plenty of newly conquered subjects who might find the price attractive. Now pull back, because Alfred's men in that swamp could see the whole board. And the board was finished. 10 years earlier, 4 English kingdoms had shared the island. Northumbria in the north, old and learned, the land of monasteries that had once taught half of Europe. It was gone, its last king dead. A Viking city rising at York, East Anglia in the east. Gone, its king used for target practice by Danish bowmen and hacked apart, its land settled by the army that killed him. Mercia in the middle, the great power of the previous century, broken and obedient. Half its territory carved off for Danish settlers, a puppet propped on what remained, and Wessex in the south, the last one standing. Wessex had held out through 9 years of invasion, through battle after battle, and its reward was this: its king in a swamp, its towns in enemy hands, its nobility submitting one household at a time. There was no 5th kingdom waiting to take up the fight. There was no army coming. Every Anglo-Saxon royal house, except one, had been extinguished or enslaved, and the one exception was hiding in the reeds of Athelney, eating stolen bread. If Guthrum's riders got lucky in those weeks, if one boatman took the reward, then the entire political existence of the English people ended in the winter mud of Somerset, and the island's future belonged to the men from the sea. The word England did not exist yet. Nobody in that marsh was fighting for England. They were fighting, at this point, for a few acres of alder scrub and another week of life. And yet the strangest fact in this whole story is already sitting there in the swamp, easy to miss under the mud and the misery. Everything was lost except one thing. In the villages of Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire, among farmers who had watched their king run for his life, something had not submitted. No Dane could collect it, because it did not live in a treasury. It lived in an oath, in the stubborn, bone-deep idea that the man in the marsh was still the king, and that when he called, you came. Whether that idea would survive the winter, nobody on the island could say. Alfred spent those weeks planning something. His enemies assumed a man in his position was planning his escape to the continent, the way every other surviving royal had gone. They were wrong about him, and the proof of how wrong would arrive with the spring. But the road to that swamp was a long one, and it did not start with Alfred, or with Guthrum, or with anyone still alive in the year 878. It started 85 years earlier, on a quiet stretch of beach on the Dorset coast, with 3 strange ships coming in from the open sea, and one government official who rode down to meet them and made the last mistake of his life. The oldest surviving record of the English people has an entry for the year 789, and it reads like a police report filed by someone who did not yet understand what he was looking at. In that year, the Chronicle says, came the first 3 ships of Northmen. The king's reeve rode down to meet them, and tried to bring them to the royal town, for he did not know what they were, and they killed him. His name, other sources tell us, was Bederherd, and his job title deserves a moment, because his job is the reason he died. He was a reeve, a royal official, the man who ran the king's business in the district around Dorchester. Strange ships had landed at Portland, and in his world, strange ships meant traders, and traders meant tolls and paperwork and a required appearance before the king's officers. So he saddled up, rode down to the waterline with a few men, and started issuing instructions to a beach full of armed Norwegians. The first Englishman ever recorded dying at Viking hands was, in effect, a customs officer demanding that the Viking age report to the front desk. 4 years later, the follow-up arrived, and this time the whole of Christian Europe heard about it. In June of 793, longships came out of the North Sea and hit the island monastery of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast. Lindisfarne was the holiest place in Britain, the cradle of northern Christianity, a treasure house of gold, relics, and defenseless monks. Sitting on an exposed tidal island with no wall worth the name, protected, everyone had assumed, by God. The raiders stripped the church to the stone, killed monks at the altar, drowned some in the sea, and carried others off in chains. A Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin, working at the court of Charlemagne, wrote home in something close to hysteria. Never before, he said, has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the street. The shock in that letter is real, and the shock is the point. The attack itself was small. What it broke was an assumption. For 300 years, the sea around Britain had been a wall. Now, suddenly, it was a road, and nobody on the island controlled who travelled it. The raiders had shallow ships that could run up a beach or a river, hit before any army could gather, and be over the horizon. By the time the local lord heard the news, every monastery, every coastal town, every river valley in Britain had just become reachable, and there was no fixing that, because the problem was geometry. Now meet the island that was about to absorb this storm, because the single most important fact about it is the one modern viewers find hardest to hold on to. There was no England. The word did not exist on any map, in any law, in any treaty. What existed south of Scotland was a patchwork of separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with its own royal family, its own army, its own laws, and a long, cheerful history of trying to destroy the others. 4 of them mattered by this point. Northumbria, in the north, past its glory days but still proud. The kingdom of scholars, the place that had produced Bede, the most famous historian in Europe. East Anglia, out on the eastern bulge, rich in farmland, weak in defences. Mercia, in the great middle of the island, and Mercia, in 789, was the superpower. Its king, Offa, dealt with Charlemagne as something close to an equal, minted the finest coinage in Britain, and had marked his frontier with Wales by raising an earthwork rampart that ran for scores of miles across hill and valley. You can walk it today. When a king can requisition that much labor, every neighbor pays attention. And then, south of the Thames, there was Wessex, the land of the West Saxons. Here is the part the later legend worked hard to bury. Wessex, at the moment the Viking Age began, was the also-ran of Anglo-Saxon Britain. It was a solid, second-tier kingdom with a habit of losing to Mercia. Offa treated its kings the way a big corporation treats a regional supplier. He interfered in its royal marriages, leaned on its politics, and when a West Saxon prince looked inconvenient, that prince tended to find himself living abroad in a hurry. The future master of England spent the 8th century getting pushed around in its own backyard. Even the family's origin story is shakier than the version its descendants sold. The royal house of Wessex claimed descent from a founder named Cerdic, who was said to have landed on the south coast with 5 ships back in the 490s, carved out a kingdom at sword point, and fathered the line that every later king traced himself to. It is a clean, heroic story, and almost every word of it comes from texts written down roughly 400 years after the fact, by scribes working for the dynasty itself. Those same royal genealogists stretched the family tree back past Cerdic to the god Woden. And then, once the kingdom was Christian, kept stretching until it reached Adam. That is not history. That is marketing. And the historians who study this period say so bluntly. The record even carries one detail the spin doctors never managed to sand off. The name Cerdic does not look Saxon at all. It looks British. A Celtic name. Native to the island, the Saxons were supposedly conquering. The founding father of the most aggressively Saxon dynasty in Britain may well have had a Briton's name, which suggests a messier, more tangled origin than the 5 ships and the sword. The honest answer about the birth of Wessex is that nobody knows, and the family preferred it that way. So hold the picture as the 9th century opens, an Iceland of rival kingdoms, tuned for slow, seasonal wars against each other, suddenly exposed to fast, seaborne raiders who obey no season and honor no border, a superpower, Mercia, whose strength is built for the old game, and a bruised runner-up, Wessex, sitting on the south coast, with its harbours facing the channel, closest of all the kingdoms to the sea lanes the storm would ride in on. No gambler in 789 would have put money on the runner-up, but the runner-up had one asset nobody had priced in, and at that moment it was living in exile on the continent. Years earlier, the machine that ran Britain, the Mercian machine, had reached into Wessex politics one more time and shoved aside a young royal claimant with too good a bloodline and too much ambition. His name was Egbert, and he had done what ambitious exiles did. He had crossed the sea and made his way to the most powerful court on earth, the court of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, the man who was rebuilding an empire out of the wreck of Rome. Egbert spent his exile there, in the halls of a ruler who commanded professional armies, standardized coinage, and a bureaucracy that could count every farm in a province. He watched how a real state worked, at the feet of the man who ran the biggest one in the West. Mercia thought it had thrown away a rival. It had actually sent him to school, and in the year 802, the exile came home. The man who rode back into Wessex in the year 802 had spent his exile watching an empire get built, and he came home with a long memory and no intention of hurrying. Egbert took the West Saxon throne that year, and the opening of his reign tells you everything about the world he inherited. On the very day he became king, the record says, a Mercian raiding force crossed the border into Wiltshire. As if the machine that ran Britain wanted to remind the new man in Wessex who actually owned the neighbourhood, the local levies beat the raiders back. Both commanders died in the fighting, and the message was received. Mercia was still the power. Wessex was still the supplier. A smart king would keep his head down. Egbert kept his head down for 23 years. That number is worth sitting with, because it is the strangest and most impressive fact about him. This was a man who had been personally humiliated by Mercian power, shoved out of his own country as a young royal, forced to beg hospitality abroad, and he came back to a throne and did not swing at the men who did it. He consolidated instead. He fought the Cornish in the far west, the kind of frontier war that seasoned troops and filled purses without attracting attention. He built up his household, placed his men, raised his son. Year after year passed, and the greatest grudge in Britain sat quietly behind a wall of patience learned at the court of Charlemagne, where Egbert had watched the Franks play politics the way engineers build bridges. Slowly, on deep foundations, for keeps. Then, in 825, Mercia looked away for a moment, tangled in a bloody dispute over its own crown, and the wall came down. The armies met at a place called Elendun, near modern Swindon, in the rolling chalk downland of Wiltshire, and what happened there was remembered in a single line of verse that survived for generations. Elendun's stream ran red with blood, was choked with the slain, grew foul with the rot. That is the entire battlefield report. No troop numbers, no manoeuvres, no speeches, just a small river full of dead men, which tells you the fighting was close, sustained, and merciless. Two shield walls grinding against each other until one of them came apart. The one that came apart was Mercian. Elendun broke the old order of Britain in an afternoon, and Egbert, who had waited 23 years, did not waste 23 days in exploiting it. He sent his son Ethelwulf east with an army, and the sub-kingdoms that Mercia had dominated for a century, Kent, Sussex, Surrey, Essex, came over to Wessex in a rush, some at sword point, some at the speed of a signature, because the local elites could read a battlefield as well as anyone. Within a year, everything south of the Thames answered to one king for the first time in living memory. East Anglia rose against Mercia and asked for Egbert's protection, and, in 829, the old superpower itself submitted, its king driven out, its territory occupied, its mints briefly stamping coins with Egbert's name on them. The chronicle records that even Northumbria, proud, distant Northumbria, met him at the border and offered submission and peace. The dynasty's house, historians, writing 2 generations later, could hardly contain themselves. They reached back into Bede's old history, found an antique term for an overlord of all Britain, Britwalda, wide ruler, and awarded it to Egbert like a trophy, slotting him into a list of legendary overkings as the 8th and greatest. It made a wonderful family story. The exile who came home and conquered everything. It was also, as an honest accounting, inflated. The submission of Northumbria was a handshake, not an occupation. Mercia shook off West Saxon control within a year or two and got its own king back. What Egbert actually held hard. in his fist and not on parchment, was the south, the block of territory from Cornwall to Kent. That was the real prize. And unlike the trophy title, it never slipped away. And it is inside that southern block, in the unglamorous years after the famous battle, that Egbert and his son did the work that matters most to this story. The work that fills no chronicle entries and won no poems. They organized what they had taken. The tool they used was already lying around in Wessex, and it was called the Shire. The kingdom had long been divided into these districts: Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset. Each one a unit of land big enough to raise an army and small enough to govern. Each one answering to the king through two men: an ealdorman who led its fighting men, and a reeve who ran its money, its courts, and its royal estates. A shire reeve, a title that English mouths would eventually grind down into the word sheriff, the same office Americans still elect in nearly every county in the United States, 11 centuries later. The genius of the system was that it did not depend on any particular nobleman's loyalty. The shire was permanent. Families rose and fell. Ealdormen died in battle or disgrace, and the unit itself sat there, generation after generation, collecting the king's dues and mustering the king's men. As the new territories in the east came under West Saxon control, the family did not simply demand oaths from their new subjects. They extended the grid. Kent, Sussex, Surrey. The old sub-kingdoms kept their identities, but were wired, piece by piece, into the same administrative machine that ran Hampshire. Nobody wrote a victory song about that. Victory songs were for streams running red. But mark the difference between the two kinds of power, because the 9th century was about to test both. Mercia's supremacy had rested on the prestige and terror of individual kings. And when those kings faltered, the supremacy evaporated. The thing Egbert was building was designed to survive its builder. He died in 839, an old man by the standards of his age. Nearly 40 years, a king counting the exile. And he did one more unusual thing on the way out. He left a kingdom with an undisputed heir, his son Ethelwulf, already crowned in the eastern territories, already experienced in war and government. A grown, tested man stepping into a functioning system, after a century in which West Saxon kings had regularly succeeded each other by coup, failed, and forced retirement into monasteries. The crown passed as smoothly as a deed to property. It was the quietest achievement of Egbert's life. And within a generation, it would matter more than Elendun, because the timing of that death deserves one final look. In the last years of Egbert's reign, the entries in the chronicle begin to change character. 835, heathen men ravaged the Isle of Sheppey. 836, Egbert fought 35 ship companies of Danes at Carhampton, and the Danes held the field. 838, a great pirate fleet joined forces with the Cornish, and the old king had to march west one last time to break the combination at Hingston Down. He won that one. But run your eye down those entries and notice what the enemy is doing. 35 ships is not 3 ships. A fleet that negotiates alliances with the Cornish is not a gang of beach robbers. Somewhere out beyond the horizon, in ways no one in Wessex could see clearly. The scale of the thing was growing. Egbert had spent his life mastering the old game. The game of Saxon against Saxon. Patience against pride, and he had won it completely. His reward was to hand his son the winning position on a board that was about to be flipped over. The year 851 opens in the chronicle with a sentence that would have made every reader in Wessex stop cold. That year, for the first time, the heathen men stayed through the winter. Stayed. One word. And the whole shape of the war changed. For 2 generations, the raids had followed a rhythm everyone understood. The ships came with the sailing season, hit what they could reach, and went home before the autumn gales. Back to Denmark and Norway with their loot. Terrible, but survivable. The way a coastline survives storms. A kingdom could rebuild a burned monastery. What it could not do was ignore an enemy who beached his ships on the Isle of Thanet, off the Kentish coast, dug in, and sat there through Christmas, eating Kentish grain, watching the roads, waiting for spring in your front yard. Wintering over meant the raiders no longer thought of Britain as a place to visit. They were beginning to think of it as a place to keep. That same year, the other shoe dropped. A fleet, the chronicle numbers at 350 ships, came up the Thames estuary. Treat the number the way this story treats all chronicle numbers, as a shout rather than a count. But even shouted down by half, it describes something no living Englishman had seen. An armada. The crews stormed Canterbury, the holiest city in the south. Then they took London itself, and drove the Mercian king and his army off the field. 2 of the great towns of Britain, gone in a single campaign season. The storm that had been rising for 60 years had finally made landfall, and it made landfall on the doorstep of the man who had inherited Egbert's kingdom. Ethelwulf is the forgotten king of this family, wedged in memory between his famous father and his very famous youngest son, and history has never quite known what to do with him. Even the chroniclers give him a slightly puzzled respect. He was pious to a degree unusual, even for a pious age. Generous with the church. More interested in Rome than in glory. But watch what he did in 851. Because the forgotten king delivered. On the battlefield. The greatest victory over the Vikings that Anglo-Saxon England ever won. The Danish army from the ships, flush with Canterbury and London, crossed the Thames and came south into Surrey, into the heart of the West Saxon world. Ethelwulf met them at a place called Aclea, Oak Field, with the levies of Wessex. And this time, no stream ran red for the Saxons. The Chronicle, which is stingy with praise and knew this event mattered, says that Ethelwulf and his son made the greatest slaughter of a heathen army that we have ever heard tell of. Up to this present day, those clerks were writing decades later, with full knowledge of everything that came after, and they let the sentence stand. The greatest slaughter ever. Wessex, the kingdom closest to the sea lanes. The kingdom, every gambler would have written off in 789, had just proven it could stand in the open field and destroy a full-scale Viking army. And here is what makes Ethelwulf worth remembering. He seems to have understood, better than the men cheering him, exactly how little the victory settled. A battle killed one army. It did nothing to the 1,000 ships still in the fjords. Nothing to the geometry of the sea roads. Nothing to the arithmetic of a fight where the enemy chose every time and place and could simply decline to show up until the odds suited him. Aclea bought time. The question was, what to spend the time on? And Ethelwulf spent it on the least glamorous thing a warrior king can think about. He spent it on his own death. He had 5 sons, Aethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred, and Alfred, with an eldest, Aethelstan, who ruled the eastern territories as a sub-king and then disappears from the record. Dead before his father. 5 sons sounds like wealth. Ethelwulf, watching the storm, saw it as a problem in sequencing. If the crown passed by simple father-to-son inheritance, then a king killed in battle, and kings were now getting killed in battle, might leave the kingdom to a child. And a child king in wartime was a death sentence for everyone. So the family worked out an arrangement, formalized in the old king's will, that cut across the normal instincts of dynasty. The brothers would succeed each other, brother after brother. Each grown man stepping up as the one before him fell, and the family treasure would be held in ways that kept the survivors strong. The scheme had costs, and the eldest sons could count them. It meant a prince might wait his whole life and die waiting. It very nearly tore the family apart at least once, when Ethelbald, the heir, rose against his father in everything but open war and forced the old man to split the kingdom to keep the peace. But the design held, and hold in your mind what it was designed for. This was a royal family organizing itself like a unit that expects to take casualties. Which brings us to the youngest, the 5th in line. The boy, nobody planned around. Alfred was born around 849, at the royal estate of Wantage, and everything the sources let us see of his childhood points away from a throne. He was the baby of the family, his mother's favourite by the family's own account, a boy who loved English poetry and learned to recite it before he could read. Because, and this detail survives from the people who knew him, nobody had bothered to teach him to read. He was also sick, on and off, all his life, with a chronic, humiliating illness. His biographer describes in enough detail that modern physicians have argued over the diagnosis for a century, and he had seen the world in a way his brothers had not. Twice, as a small child, he was sent on the long pilgrim road to Rome. Once, at about age 4, once with his father. And in Rome, the Pope had dressed the little boy in the robes of a Roman consul and stood as a kind of ceremonial sponsor to him. Family legend later inflated that ceremony into a prophecy of kingship. At the time it meant something simpler. This was the spare of spares. The son, a pious father, could afford to point toward God and books, because 4 healthy brothers stood between him and any crown. Ethelwulf died in 858, in his bed, his succession machine oiled and ready, and for a few years it seemed the machine might rust unused. Ethelbald reigned and died. Ethelbert reigned, fought off a sack of Winchester, and died. The crowns consolidated. The brothers moved up the ladder in order, exactly as designed, and the raids went on as background weather. Bad, but familiar. Then came the autumn of 865, and an entry in the Chronicle that needs no dressing up, because the men who wrote it chose its name, and the name says everything. That year, the record states, a great heathen army came into the land of the East Angles, and took winter quarters there, and were provided with horses, and the East Angles made peace with them. Not a fleet this time, an army. The chroniclers had watched Viking forces come and go for 70 years and had never used that word this way, and they attached to it the adjective that stuck for all time. Heathen here. The great heathen army. It had not come to raid anything. Armies that buy horses and negotiate winter quarters are not planning to leave. The invasion of England had begun, and the family designed to take casualties was about to start taking them. The army that landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865 did not burn anything, and that was the most frightening thing about it. The East Angles, given a choice between fighting and paying, paid, and the invaders spent a quiet winter eating East Anglian bread and buying East Anglian horses. Later tradition put names on the men in command, and the names travelled with a story. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba, sons of the legendary raider Ragnar Lothbrok, come to avenge their father's death in a Northumbrian snake pit. The saga writers loved that tale and told it for centuries, and it should be filed where it belongs, with the legends, written down generations later by poets who liked their history to rhyme with revenge. What the sober record shows is bad enough. Several veteran warlords had pooled their crews into a single force of thousands. Professionals who had spent their working lives tearing pieces off of Frankish kingdoms, and they had brought that experience to an island whose defenders had never seen anything bigger than a raiding fleet. The horses were the message, for anyone sober enough to read it. Ships rule coastlines. Horses take countries. In the spring of 866, the army mounted up, rode north across Mercia without touching it, and went straight for the richest and most divided target on the island. Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war. Two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, fighting over the throne. On the 1st of November, while the two of them glared at each other, the great army walked into York, the greatest city of the north, a former Roman legionary fortress whose stone walls still stood. The rival kings, understanding too late, did the one thing they had refused to do for years. They joined forces. In March of 867 they stormed the city together, actually broke inside the walls, and there, in the streets and courts of old Roman York, the great army turned and destroyed them. Both kings died. The Northumbrian nobility bled out in a single afternoon, and the oldest, proudest kingdom of Anglo-Saxon Britain, the land of Bede and the great monasteries, the kingdom that had once taught Europe to read, simply ceased to exist as an independent power. The army installed a puppet, taxed the wreckage, and looked south. Mercia came next, in its turn, and Mercia chose the East Anglian option. The army seized the fortress town of Nottingham in 868 and wintered there. The Mercian king called for help from Wessex, and help actually came: an army under the West Saxon king Ethelred, fourth of Ethelwulf's 5 sons, with his youngest brother Alfred beside him, 19 years old. Riding to his first real war, the allied host surrounded Nottingham, stared at the walls, and discovered the future. The Vikings declined to come out. Storming a fortified position would cost more than anyone was prepared to pay. The siege sagged. The Mercians negotiated. The army of Wessex went home, having accomplished nothing, and the great army rode back to York fatter than before. Alfred's first campaign taught him a lesson he never forgot. Courage was not the problem. The problem was that nobody south of the Humber knew how to make a stubborn enemy fight when he did not feel like fighting. Then, in 869, the army came back for East Anglia, the kingdom that had fed it, horsed it, and hoped it would stay someone else's problem. This time there was no deal on offer. The young East Anglian king, Edmund, fought, lost, and was captured, and what happened next comes down through church tradition. written within living memory of the event. The Danes demanded he share his kingdom and renounce his faith. He refused both. They tied him to a tree, shot him full of arrows. The account says, until he bristled like a hedgehog, and cut off his head. Within a generation, the martyred king had a shrine, a cult, and a town growing around his bones. Bury St. Edmunds, and pilgrims by the thousand. The Danes had created the first patron saint of the English, and they had also, in passing, deleted the second of the four kingdoms, Northumbria, gone, East Anglia, gone, Mercia, paying tribute and living on sufferance. That left one. The great army moved on Wessex at the end of 870, seizing the royal estate at Reading, a strong point in the angle where the river Kennet meets the Thames, and fortifying it as a forward base. What followed has no parallel in the whole Viking Age in England. A single year of continuous, grinding, full-scale war, and the chronicle counts it out almost breathlessly. 9 general engagements in 12 months, plus countless skirmishes the record does not bother to name. It began with a local success, the ealdorman of Berkshire cutting up a Viking foraging party. Then the brothers, King Ethelred and Alfred, attacked Reading itself and were bloodily repulsed at the gates. 4 days later, the whole Viking army came out after them, and the hosts met on the high chalk downland at a place the record calls Ashdown, the story that survives, from the family's own historian, has a strange human centre. King Ethelred, hearing mass in his tent as the armies formed, refused to move until the priest finished, declaring he would not leave God's service for any man's. The Viking line was already advancing uphill. Alfred, 21 years old, commanding half the army and watching the distance close, made the call himself. He charged, the account says, like a wild boar, and slammed his shield wall into the enemy before they could take the top of the ridge, and held the grinding, screaming press of it until his brother's division came up. By dark, the great army was running for Reading, leaving a Viking king and 5 jarls dead on the field, and the slope littered with bodies for miles. Ashdown was a real victory, won at the worst odds, and it changed almost nothing. That is the arithmetic this chapter exists to show. 2 weeks later, the Vikings beat the brothers at Basing. They beat them again in a 2-stage slaughterhouse of a battle at Meritoun, where the English held the field most of the day and lost it by nightfall. A fresh Viking fleet, the Summer Army, sailed up the Thames to reinforce Reading, replacing every man Ashdown had cost and more. And in the middle of it, just after Easter of 871, King Ethelred died, worn out or wounded. The record does not say. The 4th of Ethelwulf's 5 sons to take the crown, and the 3rd to die holding it in a single decade. He left small sons. Nobody even discussed them. Under the family's old succession compact, the arrangement built for exactly this moment. The crown passed sideways to the last man standing, the sickly, book-loving 5th son, who had never expected any of this, and the Wighton confirmed him at once. Because a kingdom at war needed a grown man on a horse. Alfred was 22, and he buried his brother and inherited an army that had been beaten twice in a month. Within 30 days, he was fighting for his life at Wilton with a force so thinned that the chronicle stops pretending. A small band against the whole army. And he lost. 9 battles had killed thousands of men. 1 king. Uncounted nobles. And the third of Wessex was scraped hollow. So the new king did the thing that no legend celebrates, and every surviving source records without shame. He paid. The sources call it making peace. And everyone understood what that meant. Silver, counted out to the great army in exchange for their departure. The Vikings, who had also bled all year, took the money and rode north. The last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom had survived its first invasion by purchasing the enemy's absence, and the king who signed the receipt was the man history would call Alfred the Great. He got 7 years. He spent them watching the storm eat everyone else. London taken. Mercia's king driven overseas and replaced with a Viking client. The great army finally splitting, half of it settling down to farm Northumbria, the other half, the hungrier half, gathering under a warlord named Guthrum, who studied Wessex from across the border like a man studying a lock. 3 times Guthrum probed, seizing Wareham, slipping to Exeter, swearing peace on his holy ring and breaking it. Each time Alfred contained him, paid him, manoeuvred him out, and then Guthrum stopped probing the kingdom's fortresses and aimed at its calendar. He waited for the 12 nights of Christmas. In the winter of 877, going on 878, when the war was supposed to be asleep, and he rued for Chippenham, for the king's own hall, for Alfred's family in their beds. You know this part. You watched it happen in the dark at the start of this story. The gates, the feast, the flight into the snow. The road from the 3 ships at Portland has run 89 years. Through Lindisfarne and Ellendune and York and Ashdown, and it ends where this story began, at a swamp in Somerset, with the last king of the English hiding in the reeds. What you have not seen is the way out. Spring comes late to the Somerset levels, and in the year 878 it came to a kingdom that officially no longer existed. Guthrum held Chippenham and the heart of Wessex. His riders worked the shires, collecting submissions from Thegns who could see no reason to die for a king nobody could find. Across the sea in Francia, Port Gossip was already treating Wessex as finished. One more English kingdom folded into the Danish winnings, and out in the marshes, on the low island of Athelney, the government of the West Saxons, a king, his family, and a war band small enough to feed by theft, was learning to fight in a new way, because the old way needed an army, and the army was gone. What Athelney offered was invisibility. The levels in late winter were a maze of floodwater, reed beds, and bottomless mud, crossable only by boat or by causeways the locals kept to themselves. And the locals, this is the detail that decided everything, kept them for Alfred. From that cover the king ran a guerrilla war, small mounted parties striking out at dusk, hitting Danish foraging columns, cutting down messengers, raiding the estates of collaborators, then melting back into the waterland where no pursuit could follow. The point was never to win. The point was to stay alive, stay visible in rumour if nowhere else, and keep one fact flickering in every village in Wessex through that terrible winter. The king had not fled overseas. The king was still on English ground, and still fighting. It is to these months that the most famous story about Alfred attaches the one where a fugitive king, sheltering anonymous in a swineherd's hut, is set to watch the loaves baking at the fire, lets them burn while his mind chews on his ruined kingdom, and takes a furious scolding from the swineherd's wife, who sees only a useless vagrant too lazy to turn bread. The tale appears nowhere in Alfred's lifetime. It surfaces in a saint's life, written maybe a century later. And it should be labelled the way this story labels all its perfect scenes. Legend, not record. But notice what the legend is doing. Because whoever invented it understood this king. It is the lowest moment any storyteller ever gave an English monarch. A king so reduced that a peasant woman can yell at him about bread. And England never let go of it. Nations keep the stories they need. This one says that the bottom is survivable. What the sober record shows for those same weeks is better than the legend. It shows a communications operation from a hideout in a swamp, with the country under enemy occupation. Alfred's people were quietly reaching the leadership of 3 shires, Somerset, Wiltshire, and the western half of Hampshire, carrying dates and a location. That is the fact, hiding inside the miracle of what happened next. And it is the fact that should stop you cold. 7 weeks after Easter, the message went out, and the message was obeyed. In the 7th week after Easter, the Chronicle says, Alfred rode to Egbertstone, east of Selwood Forest, and there came to meet him all the men of Somerset and Wiltshire and part of Hampshire, and they rejoiced to see him. Stand in that clearing for a moment, because this is the hinge of the whole story, and it is worth seeing clearly. A king who had lost his capital, his treasury, his fortresses, and by every visible measure his kingdom, stepped out of a marsh and called an army into being with words carried by hand. Every man in that muster had spent the winter with a Danish occupation force in riding distance, and a king who was a rumour in a swamp. And when the summons came, they armed themselves, walked away from their farms, and came. No silver paid them, no garrison forced them. The machine that Egbert had wired into the shires, the machine of reeves and musters and oaths, had just been tested to destruction, king deleted, territory occupied, and it had worked anyway. Guthrum had captured everything in Wessex except the thing that made it run. Alfred gave the reunion one night. The next morning, he marched. Because an improvised army of farmers gets weaker every day, it stands still. And speed was the only surprise he had left. 2 days later, he found what he was looking for on the chalk upland at the edge of Salisbury Plain, near a fort called Eddington, Guthrum's army, out of it fortifications, drawn up to meet him in the open field. The battle that decided whether England would ever exist gets 1 sentence of tactics in the record, and the sentence is enough. Fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall, it says, Alfred at length gained the victory. Inside that sentence is a mourning of the oldest and worst kind of combat human beings have invented. 2 walls of overlapping shields slamming into each other, spear points working the gaps, men heaving and stabbing and dying in a space narrower than a village street, until one wall buckled. It was the Danes' wall that buckled. The army that had destroyed Northumbria, martyred Edmund, swallowed Mercia, and hunted Alfred through the Christmas snow broke, and ran for Chippenham with West Saxon riders, killing them the whole 14 miles home. Alfred reached the fortress on their heels, seized everything outside the walls. The horses, the cattle, the grain, and settled down to starve them out. 14 days. That is all it took. The great army's remnant, packed inside Chippenham with no supplies and no relief coming, asked for terms. And the terms Alfred offered are the reason this chapter is the hinge of the story and not just its best battle. He could have massacred them. Precedent was on his side, and so was every grieving family in Wessex. Instead, Alfred demanded hostages and oaths, and then something no English king had ever demanded of a Viking army. He demanded its commander's soul. Guthrum was to accept baptism, become a Christian, and take Alfred as his godfather. 3 weeks later, at the church of Allah, a few miles from the swamp, where Alfred had spent the winter as a fugitive, the warlord who had hunted him waded into the font. Alfred stood sponsor, and Guthrum came up out of the water with a new white robe and a new name, Aethelstan, an English royal name, the name of Alfred's own dead, eldest brother. Then the two of them went to the royal estate at Wedmore and feasted for 12 days, king and godson, and Alfred gave gifts to the man who had burned his towns, honouring him, the record says, with great wealth. Cynics have read that baptism as theatre, and Guthrum could act. But watch what the water actually did, because Alfred had thought this through. A pagan warlord could break any oath, and Guthrum had personally proven it, swearing peace on the sacred ring at Wareham and riding out to break it. A baptized king, godson to the King of Wessex, was inside a different system, bound by the same God, the same church, the same web of spiritual kinship that governed every Christian ruler in Europe. Alfred could not exterminate the Danes of Britain. There were too many, rooted too deep, from York to East Anglia. So he did something colder and longer-sighted. He converted his enemy into a neighbour, with an address, a crown, a christened name, and something to lose. The treaty that followed drew the consequences on the map. Guthrum took his army east and settled it in East Anglia as its king, dividing the land among his men, who put down their spears, most of them, and picked up ploughs. A boundary was fixed between the two powers. Up the Thames, along the River Lea north of London, then along the old Roman road called Watling Street, running diagonally across the island, southwest of that line. English law, northeast of it. The law of the Danes. The Dane law, a name that would mark maps, dialects, and place names for centuries, and marks some of them still. Look at that map as the treaty ink dries, because everyone in it thought they were looking at a final settlement. Guthrum had a kingdom. The Danes of York and East Anglia and the Eastern Midlands had their farms, and Alfred had roughly half of the Old English world, the last surviving kingdom, saved from extinction by a winter in a swamp and one morning of shield work at Eddington. Half was more than anyone in the Marsh would have dared pray for. The Danes assumed half was the end of the story. They had made a reasonable assumption about a reasonable man, and they had just watched him hand out feast gifts and godfather blessings like a king content with survival. They would spend the next 80 years finding out what his family actually had in mind. There is a town in the Thames Valley called Wallingford, and if you walk its western edge today, you can still climb a grassy bank that has been sitting there for 1100 years. Tourists walk their dogs on it. It looks like a landscaping feature. It is actually a weapon, and it was built by a king who had decided that the next Viking war would be fought before it started. Alfred came out of the Edington campaign with a conclusion burned into him, and everything he did for the rest of his life flows from it. Wessex had survived on luck, loyalty, and one morning of shield work, and no kingdom gets that lucky twice. The Danes of the island now had homes, which meant the next war would come from 20 miles away instead of across the North Sea, and the Danes of the continent were still circling, huge fleets working the Frankish rivers, always one bad harvest away from trying Britain again. Peace, to Alfred, was a construction window, so he spent it constructing. Start at Wallingford, because Wallingford shows the whole system in one place. Alfred's engineers picked a spot where an ancient road forded the Thames, and they laid out a town that had never existed before. From nothing, on a plan you could draw with a ruler, a great rectangle of earthen ramparts, ditched in front, timber faced, enclosing over 100 acres. Inside, a grid of streets crossing at right angles, Roman style, with a market at the centre and house lots marked off along the lanes. A perimeter track ran just inside the walls so defenders could move to any threatened section at speed. This was not a fort in the old sense, a refuge on a hilltop where people cowered while their farms burned. It was a fortified town, designed to be lived in, traded in, and defended all at once, permanently. Then Alfred built 30 more of them, the document that proves it survives, and it is one of the most remarkable pieces of paper to come out of the early Middle Ages. Historians call it the Burghall Hidage, and it is, bluntly, a spreadsheet. It lists roughly 33 fortified places, burhs, in the English of the time, covering the whole kingdom, and for each one, it records a number, the number of hides of land assigned to its upkeep, a hide being the amount of farmland reckoned to support one household. Then it states the formula, written out with the patience of a man, explaining the obvious to posterity. If every hide is represented by one man, then every pole of wall, about 5 yards, can be manned by 4 men, 16 hides to a pole of rampart. And from there you can calculate, and the clerks did calculate, exactly how many men owed service to every yard of every wall in Wessex. Wallingford's assessment was 2,400 hides. Run the formula, and that manned about 3,000 yards of defences, which is almost to the stride, the length of the ramparts that still stand there. The math on the 1,100-year-old spreadsheet checks out against the dirt. Add up the whole list and the scale comes into focus. Something like 27,000 men were enrolled to garrison the walls of Wessex, drawn from the farms assigned to each burh, in a kingdom whose total population was maybe 500,000, and the placement was the real genius. The burhs were spaced so that no village in Wessex lay more than about 20 miles from one, a single day's walk. Picture what that meant for the two sides of the next war. For a West Saxon family, safety was never more than 1 day away. Your grain, your cattle, your children behind ramparts before the raiders arrived. For a Viking column, the arithmetic of raiding collapsed. Everywhere you rode, there was a walled town on your flank, full of armed men, sitting on your line of retreat. You could bypass it and be cut off, or besiege it and lose the speed that was your whole advantage. The Boers did not have to win battles. They made the raid itself. The basic business model of the Viking Age. Stop paying. Alfred rebuilt the field army on the same principle, that the war had to be survivable by ordinary life. The old Fyrd was a flash flood. Every able man called out at once, which meant that after a few weeks the army dissolved, because if it stayed, the harvest died and the kingdom starved. Alfred split it. Half the eligible men served, while half stayed home. Then they rotated, which sounds simple and changed everything. Wessex could now keep a mounted force in the field indefinitely. Through harvest, through winter, through the long patient months that sieges demanded, the exact months in which every previous English army had melted away. He tinkered with ships too, ordering vessels built to his own design, bigger than the Danish boats, some with 60 oars, to meet raiders in the water before they landed. The Chronicle dutifully records the new fleet's first engagements, which were a mixed bag. Several ships ran aground at an awkward moment, and the king's naval genius should not be oversold. What matters is the direction of thought. A defense in depth, sea to shore to wall, each layer buying time for the next. None of this was free, and Alfred paid for it in the currency kings guard most jealously. He spent his popularity, the sources admit, in the careful language of men writing about a living king's family, that the burden was hated, that the king had to cajole, pressure, and punish to get his walls built, that some works were left half-finished by local shirking until a Danish raid demonstrated, at the cost of the shirkers' own barns, why the king had been shouting, "Building the future is a miserable business to live through." Every hide of land in the kingdom now owed wall work, garrison duty, or army service, catalogued and enforced, and a West Saxon farmer of the 880s, cutting turf for a rampart he had been taxed to raise, may be forgiven for not knowing he was constructing the most sophisticated defensive system Western Europe had seen since Rome. He was also, though nobody involved could know it, building the street plan of the English-speaking world. Towns need walls, but they live by markets, and Alfred understood the connection. Inside the ramparts, trade could happen in safety. So trade moved inside the ramparts. Mints followed. Royal coinage struck behind royal walls, and law followed the mints. And within a few generations, the burghs had grown into the boroughs, the ordinary English word for a chartered town. The word sailed with English colonists across the Atlantic, which is why the city of New York, 11 centuries later and an ocean away, is organized into 5 boroughs. Every time a New Yorker says the word, a little piece of Alfred's civil defense program comes out of their mouth. The test arrived, as Alfred always insisted it would, in the 890s, when a huge Viking army, beaten and starved out of Francia, crossed the Channel to try the old hunting grounds one more time. Hundreds of ships, veterans of the Continental Wars, exactly the nightmare the whole system had been built against. The war that followed ran 4 years and produced no Eddington, no single day of decision. And that was the point. The army that had once taken York in an afternoon spent those years being herded. Burgh garrisons hung on its flanks. The rotating field army followed it wherever it moved, month after month, without dissolving. When the Danes fortified a camp, The English besieged it in shifts. When they lunged at a town, the town shut its gates and held until relief came. The invaders won skirmishes and took plunder and accomplished, strategically, nothing. And in 896, the great army simply gave up, the chronicle recording its dissolution with a kind of exhausted shrug. Some to East Anglia, some to Northumbria, and those without stock got ships and went south across the sea to the Seine. The most dangerous fighting force in Europe had run into a kingdom redesigned as a machine for wasting its time. And the machine had won. The walls, then, held, but Alfred had concluded, in the same years he was building them, that walls were treating the symptom. The kingdom had nearly died, and he had spent long nights in the Marsh asking why God had allowed it. And the answer he arrived at had nothing to do with ramparts. The answer, he decided, was that his people had forgotten how to think. Somewhere around his 40th year, the King of Wessex sat down with a tutor, like a schoolboy, and began learning Latin. Hold that image, because there is nothing else like it in the early Middle Ages. A reigning warrior king, scarred veteran of Ashdown and Eddington, ruler of the last English kingdom, conjugating verbs. Alfred had been functionally illiterate into adulthood by the standards of scholarship. A man who loved books, the way you can love music you cannot play. And he had decided, in the middle of running a kingdom under siege, to fix it personally. His biographer, a Welsh priest named Asa, who worked beside him and wrote his life while the king still lived, describes Alfred keeping a little book of prayers and psalms in the fold of his cloak, collecting passages the way other kings collected relics, and pestering his scholars at all hours, reading and translating through the night candle. Asa is a friendly witness, employed by the subject, and this story has taught you to handle friendly witnesses with care. But the documents that survive in Alfred's own voice back the portrait, and the portrait is of a man in a hurry, educating himself at 40, because something enormous depended on it. Here is what Alfred believed depended on it, in his own words, more or less. Around the year 890, a letter went out from the king to the bishops of his kingdom, and by extraordinary luck a copy survives. In it, the king looks back at the wreckage of the invasions and makes a diagnosis that no other ruler of the age came near. Learning, he writes, had so completely decayed in England that when he came to the throne, he could not think of a single man south of the Thames who could translate a letter from Latin into English, or even follow the meaning of the services in church. The churches stood full of books, he says, and the books might as well have been stones, because nobody left alive could read them. And then the sentence that shows the size of the man's mind. The wisdom was here once. He says, we had it, and we lost it, and the ruin around us is what losing it looks like. A different king would have ordered the clergy to learn Latin and considered the problem handled. Alfred's solution ran the other direction, and it is one of the great swerves in the history of thought. If the learning was locked in Latin and the people spoke English, then the learning would come to the people. He announced a translation program, naming the goal in plain terms. Certain books, the ones most necessary for all men to know, turned into the language we can all understand, and every free-born young man in England who had the means to be spared, for it set to learning his letters in English, until he could read English writing well. Latin could come later, For those bound for the church, English came first. For everyone, measure the strangeness of that decision against its time. Everywhere else in Christian Europe, serious knowledge lived in Latin. Full stop. The languages people actually spoke were considered fit for markets and jokes and not much else. And here was a king on a half-burned island declaring that his people's own tongue, the language of swineherds and shield walls, would carry philosophy, history, theology, the whole cargo of civilization. Alfred did not merely sponsor the work, he did some of it with his own hands. Between the wars and the law cases, and the endless business of a 9th century court, the king translated books himself, working with his scholars, and his choices tell you what he thought a broken country needed. A handbook for clergy on how to actually lead people, a work of history that set England's story inside the story of the world, and The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, a book written 3 centuries earlier by a Roman statesman in prison waiting for execution. A book about how a thinking man holds himself together when fortune takes everything. Alfred did not translate that one like a copyist. He wrestled with it, added to it, argued with it in the margins, and at one point set down a line of his own that has been quoted for 1,000 years. Because it is as close as we get to hearing the man think. "This is my will," he wrote, "to live worthily as long as I live, and after my life, to leave to the men who come after me my memory in good works." Out of the same workshop, around the same year, came a project with a longer fuse, someone at Alfred's court, and the fingerprints of royal sponsorship are all over it, compiled a year-by-year record of the English people from the earliest times to the present, in English, and arranged for copies to be distributed and continued. You have been listening to it this whole story. It is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the source of the 3 ships at Portland, the great heathen army. The 7th week after Easter. Be clear-eyed about what it is, because this story has leaned on it and will lean on it to the end. It is a masterpiece, and it is a house organ. History, as the family wished it remembered. Generous to Alfred's ancestors. Quiet about their failures. Dismissive of rivals. Its makers were building a version of the past in which Wessex had always been the trunk of the English tree. Every nation tells itself such stories. What is remarkable is the instrument, a running national history kept in the people's own language, copied and continued in religious houses for centuries. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in Europe, and when the dynasty that commissioned it was dust, monks who had never seen Alfred's face were still adding entries to his book. The law code belongs to the same design. Late in the reign, Alfred issued a great compilation of law, and the method mattered more than the statutes. He gathered the old codes of the English peoples, the laws of Kent, the laws of Mercia, the laws of his own West Saxon ancestors, selected among them, and bound the result together under a long preface that opened with the 10 Commandments and ran through the law of Moses to the present, setting English justice inside 4,000 years of God's dealings with mankind. Notice the quiet claim stitched into the structure. A king of Wessex was legislating with the legal inheritance of all the English peoples, as if their laws were one family's property to tend. Nobody had ever done that. And notice. Finally, the words the court began to use for itself, because words were this king's chosen ground. And this is where the whole chapter has been heading. In the treaty with Guthrum, in the Chronicle, in the charters of the last years. A term keeps surfacing that had never carried political weight before. Angel sin. The English kind. The English people. All of them, not West Saxons or Mercians or the men of Kent. Alfred's documents start calling him king of the angel sin, and his coins and charters experiment with the same reach. Be precise about what this was and was not. There was no country called England, and Alfred never ruled one. Half the English people lived under Danish lords beyond Watling Street, and Alfred's actual power stopped at a treaty line. What the court was doing was minting an idea. The idea that everyone who spoke this language and shared this law and this history was one people, whose natural head was the House of Wessex. The Kingdom of England did not yet exist in land. It now existed in grammar. Worthing. There is one more thing to say about the language program, and it concerns everyone hearing these words. The English that Alfred wrote is the direct ancestor of the English in this sentence. The line runs unbroken. From the Marsh King's translation desk, through Chaucer and Shakespeare and the King James Bible, across the Atlantic, in the holds of colony ships, through the Declaration of Independence, to the 400 million people who now speak it from birth, and the billion more who learned it after. It survived conquest, which this story will come to, and it swallowed its conquerors, which this story will also come to. Of everything the House of Wessex built, the walls, the armies, the kingdom itself. The oldest thing still in daily service is the decision of one self-taught king that his people's language was good enough for wisdom. Alfred died on the 26th of October, 899, at about 50 years old, of the illness that had shadowed his whole life. He had reigned 28 years and was buried at Winchester, and posterity, which he thought about constantly, gave him in time the name no other English monarch has ever carried, Alfred the Great. But his real legacy walked behind his coffin, and it walked on two sets of feet. A son, Edward, raised from boyhood in the field armies, hard, capable, and hungry, and a daughter, Ethelfled, married into what remained of Mercia, where she had been watching, learning, and building for a decade. The father had saved a kingdom and imagined a people. The children intended to go get them. In the summer of 918, a delegation rode south out of York, the Viking capital of northern Britain, carrying an offer nobody in Europe would have believed. The men of York were prepared to submit, to swear loyalty, to accept overlordship, and the ruler they had chosen to kneel to was a woman. To understand how impossible that sentence is, you have to know the rules of the 10th century. Women did not rule, not in the Viking world, not in the English world, not anywhere in the Latin West. A royal woman was a treaty written in flesh, married to seal alliances, honored as a mother of kings, and kept a long way from armies and councils. The age had no word for what Ethelfled became, so it invented one. The chronicles call her Mercna Halafdige, the Lady of the Mercians, and by the time the riders came south from York, that title meant the most successful war leader in Britain. She was Alfred's firstborn, and her childhood was the war. She was a small girl during the flight to Athelney, old enough to remember the winter that nearly ended everything, and she grew up in the Reconstruction, in a court that talked strategy at dinner. Somewhere in her teens she was married to Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians. the nobleman who governed what remained of free Mercia, the western half that the Danes had not settled. On paper, it was the oldest move in the book. A Wessex princess sent to bind an ally. What it turned into had no paper. Mercia was a wounded and proud thing, a former superpower reduced to a client, and it needed careful handling. The couple gave it that, and gave it something better. A project. Together they refortified Worcester. Together they took a gamble that tells you everything about how they thought. In the year 886, Alfred had retaken London from the Danes, and instead of keeping the greatest prize in Britain for Wessex, he handed it to Mercia, to Ethelred and Ethelfled. Read the move for what it was. The old king was binding the two English survivors into one enterprise, and he was doing it through his daughter. Then her husband began to die. The sources say almost nothing direct, only that in his last years Ethelred was incapacitated, sick in a way that took him out of the war, and that the government of Mercia passed in practice to his wife. Watch what that means on the ground. Somebody was ordering garrisons, hearing disputes, moving money, negotiating with Wales, and that somebody, for years before her husband's death, was Ethelfled. When Ethelred finally died in 911, the Mercian nobility faced a choice with no precedent anywhere in Christendom. The natural move, the move every playbook demanded, was to fold Mercia under her brother Edward, now King of Wessex, or find some pliable nobleman for the widow to marry. The Mercians did neither. They took the woman who had already been ruling them and made it official. No marriage, no regency, no apology. The Lady of the Mercians, ruling alone. What she did with that power was build the northern half of her father's system, and she built it like a general, not an heiress. 10 fortresses in 7 years. Each one a calculated move on the map. Follow just 3 of them. At Tamworth, in 913, she planted a burh on the site of the old royal capital of Mercia, the seat of Offa himself, burned by the Danes a generation before. Every Mercian understood the message without a word spoken. The kingdom's heart was beating again, and it was beating behind her walls. At Chester she took the shell of a Roman legionary fortress. Walls the legions had razed 8 centuries earlier, and refounded it as a living town, sealing the northwestern gate of English Britain against the Norse of Ireland. And at Runcorn and Edisbury she built against a threat her brother's strategists were barely tracking, the Viking fleets working the Irish Sea, because she was fighting a 2-front war, Danes to the east, Norsemen to the west, and losing ground on neither. Then, starting in 917, the sister and brother executed the largest coordinated campaign the island had seen since the Great Army, and the coordination is the marvel. Edward struck in the south and east, hammering into Essex and East Anglia. Ethelfled struck in the Midlands. The 2 offensives rolled forward in step, season after season, each one pinning Danish forces the other would otherwise have faced, and no surviving document explains the plan, because the plan is visible only in the way the map changed, like watching 2 hands play one piece of music. Historians looking at that campaign season have stopped arguing about whether it was planned together. The only argument left is where the siblings held the meetings. Her greatest single stroke came at Derby, one of the 5 fortified boroughs the Danes had ruled for 2 generations. Ethelfled took it by storm. The hardest way a walled town can be taken, and the Mercian register, the little chronicle her own people kept, preserves the cost in a line that still stings. 4 of her thegns, men dear to her, were slain within the gates. She grieved them by name, and she kept moving. The next year, 918, Leicester, the second of the 5 boroughs, surrendered to her without a fight, its Danish garrison reading the new arithmetic and choosing terms while terms were good. A woman who could take Derby by assault was a woman you negotiated with early. Which brings the story back to those riders from York. The Danish north was cracking, squeezed between the sibling offensive and new waves of Norse raiders from Ireland. And the leading men of York had decided their best future lay in submission to the one ruler on the island who had never lost. The pledges were given. The Chronicle says, the greatest city between London and Scotland was offering itself to the Lady of the Mercians. And with it, in effect, the end of the entire war was coming into view. A generation ahead of schedule. She never collected. On the 12th of June, 918, at Tamworth, in the restored capital she had rebuilt herself, Ethelfled died. Suddenly, with the York agreement still unsealed on the table, she was somewhere in her late 40s. The record gives no cause, no illness, no warning, just the date and the place. And then, in the Irish annals of all places, far from Wessex spin doctors, a foreign chronicler paused to note the death of a famosissima Regina Saxonum, a most famous queen of the Saxons. Her own family's chronicle, the main Wessex version, gave the most consequential Englishwoman of the entire Middle Ages a few dry lines. You will see why in a moment. Count what she left. Half the reconquest was her work. The Burr line from the Mersey to the Avon was her work. Wales was quiet because 2 Welsh kings had learned to fear her. And the record shows her armies striking into Wales and taking a king's wife hostage when Mercian blood was shed. York had offered her the north. Alfred had imagined the Anglesin as one people under one house. And his daughter had done as much as any living soul to make the map match the idea. And she left one more thing, standing beside her deathbed at Tamworth, a daughter, Elfwin, grown now, unmarried, the granddaughter of Alfred the Great, and by every Mercian instinct the natural heir to her mother's title. For a few months in the autumn of 918, something extraordinary flickered into being, the second female succession in a row, a daughter following a mother into sovereign power. In the 10th century, her uncle, Edward, was watching. He had loved his sister, fought beside her, trusted her with half the war. What he was about to do to her daughter would show exactly where family stopped and statecraft began. The Mercian register, the same little chronicle that grieved for the thegns at Derby, records what happened next in a single entry, and you can feel the writer's teeth grinding through the parchment. In this year, it says, the daughter of Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, was deprived of all authority in Mercia and carried into Wessex. 3 weeks before Christmas, deprived, carried. Those are not the words of a smooth transition. Elfwin had held her mother's position for roughly 6 months when her uncle Edward moved, and the move had the clean, quiet brutality of a man who had thought it through in advance. No battle, no trial, no announcement. Royal agents arrived. Authority was transferred, and the granddaughter of Alfred the Great was escorted south across the border, out of Mercia, out of power, and out of recorded history. No marriage is documented, no convent named, no death date survives. One of the most strategically important women in Britain simply stops existing on parchment, which, in a world where parchment was controlled by her uncle's family, tells its own story. The likeliest guess, and historians admit it is a guess, is a nunnery, the standard deep storage facility for royal women whose bloodlines had become inconvenient. Sit with the ugliness of it for a moment, because the temptation is to look away, and looking away misses the point of this chapter. Edward did not do this to an enemy. He did it to his dead sister's only child. Months after that sister's work had handed him half of his victories, the Mercians had chosen Elfwin, or were moving toward choosing her, and Mercian loyalty to Alfred's line ran through her mother's grave. Edward calculated that the loyalty would survive the insult, that Mercia would swallow a king where it had loved a lady. And he was right, but be clear about what the calculation was. The unification of England was not going to be a family reunion. It was going to be an acquisition, and the first asset stripped was his own niece, with Mercia folded directly under the crown of Wessex. Edward turned back to the war. And the war, in the years 918 to 920, became a landslide. The Danish boroughs of the Midlands went down one after another. Stamford, Nottingham, Lincoln. Some stormed, most surrendering, their Danish jarls and English farmers alike swearing to Edward as the armies arrived. East Anglia, Guthrum's old kingdom, had already collapsed into his hands. By 920, the border of English royal power, which had stood at Watling Street when Alfred died, stood at the River Humber, and everything south of it, Saxon, Anglo, and Dane, answered to one king. The chronicle then records a scene in the far north, at Bakewell in the Peak district, where the rulers of the remaining island powers came to Edward and, in the chronicle's formula, chose him as father and lord, the King of Scots, the Lord of the Norse in York. The rulers of Strathclyde and Northumbria handle that scene the way you have learned to handle this family's press releases. The northern rulers were not surrendering their kingdoms. They were buying peace with a ceremony, acknowledging the strongest man in Britain in exchange for being left alone. And every one of them understood the deal as personal, binding them to Edward, not to any permanent English state. The distinction sounds like lawyers' hair-splitting, and within 5 years it would redraw the map, because personal submissions have a built-in expiration date. They expire when the person dies. Edward spent his last years learning that lesson from the inside. His final recorded act is a suppression, not a conquest. In 924, Chester rose against him. The fortress city, his own sister, had refounded, and it rose in a telling combination. The Mercians of the town, in alliance with the Welsh. Nothing in the record explains the revolt, but nothing needs to. 6 years after Elfwin was carried south, Mercia's premier stronghold preferred rebellion beside foreigners to obedience under Wessex. Edward put the rising down with his usual efficiency, and then, within days or weeks, at the royal estate of Farndon, just south of the recaptured city, he died. In the summer of 924, a king who had spent 40 years at war, won, essentially, all of it, and never once, in any surviving source, been called beloved. History has struggled with Edward ever since. And the struggle is fair. He was, by the cold measure of ground, taken, one of the most successful soldiers ever to rule in Britain. The man who turned his father's fortified survival into actual reconquest. He was also the man who erased his niece, absorbed his allies, and governed the whole enterprise with an ambition that even the family chronicle cannot quite dress up as warmth. His father had imagined one people. Edward built the thing in iron, and iron was what it took. The question he left behind was whether the weld would hold, because the kingdom he passed on was not a nation. It was a collection of conquests, submissions, and grudges, held together by the reputation of a dead man. And the succession, one last time, got complicated. Edward left sons by 3 marriages, and the 2 halves of his realm pulled in 2 directions. Wessex, the family heartland, moved for a son named Alfred, raised at Winchester, candidate of the old establishment, but Mercia declared for the eldest son, a 30-year-old who had been, for the Mercians, hiding in plain sight their whole lives. His name was Aethelstan, and his story had a shape nobody had planned. Motherless early, his mother either dead or set aside in one of his father's remarriages. He had been sent as a boy away from Winchester, north, to be raised in the household of his aunt. He had grown up in Mercia, at the court of Ethelfled, educated by the Lady of the Mercians herself, trained in her wars, known to every Mercian thing as one of their own. The boy the Wessex establishment had parked in the provinces was the one royal male in Britain who belonged to both halves of the new kingdom. Then the succession crisis solved itself with an efficiency that raised eyebrows for 1,000 years. Alfred, the Winchester candidate, died 16 days after his father. Nothing in the record accuses anyone of anything, and 16 days is a number that requires no accusation to keep a rumour alive. The road stood clear, and even so, Winchester balked, the old guard dragging its feet so hard that Ethelstan's coronation waited more than a year and, when it came, happened somewhere new. In September of 925, on a hill at Kingston upon Thames, the crown was set on Ethelstan's head. Look at the map and read the choice, because this family never chose ceremony sites by accident. Kingston sits on the Thames, the ancient boundary between Wessex and Mercia, neither fully in one nor the other, the seam of the new kingdom made into a stage. The archbishop crowned him at the border of the 2 lands that made him the son of Wessex raised by Mercia. And for the first time in the story of this family, the man under the crown was not king of a kingdom plus its conquests. He was something the island had no name for yet. He had inherited his grandfather's idea, his aunt's training, and his father's army. Within 2 years, he would inherit an opportunity, waiting for him behind the walls of York. There is a silver coin in the British Museum, small enough to lose in a pocket, and stamped into it is a set of Latin words that no ruler in the history of Britain had ever put on money before. Aethelstan Rex, Totius Britannia, Aethelstan, King of all Britain. Coins are the 10th century's mass media. A charter was read by a dozen churchmen. A coin passed through 10,000 hands, paid rents, bought ale, crossed the sea in merchants' purses. and every single one carried the same message into every market in the land, pressed in silver where no one could scrape it off. When Ethelstan's mints began striking that legend, the government of Britain was making an announcement to everyone who could read and everyone who could not. The island has one king now. Get used to it. Here is how he earned the right to strike it. When Ethelstan took the crown in 925, the north was still another country. York, the great Viking city, had a king of its own, a Norse ruler named Sigtrygg, part of the dynasty that ran the sea empire between Dublin and Northumbria. Ethelstan opened with diplomacy, the family's other weapon, and married his sister to Sigtrygg in a treaty wedding at Tamworth, in his aunt's rebuilt capital. Within a year, Sigtrygg was dead. And the deal died with him. Norse claimants moved to take York, and Ethelstan did the thing his grandfather could only have dreamed about. He marched north in 927, took York, drove the claimants into the sea and Scotland, tore down the Danish fortifications, and kept the city. No submission ceremony, no client king, no tribute arrangement, annexation. For the first time since the Roman legions sailed away 5 centuries earlier, everything English-speaking on the island of Britain, from the Channel to the edge of Scotland, obeyed a single government. 12 days after York fell, or close to it, the kings of the north came to him at a place called Eamont, near Penrith, and this time the ceremony had teeth. The King of Scots, the King of Strathclyde, the English lord of the far northern hills. They met Ethelstan at the river and swore, and the chronicle uses the language of peace confirmed with pledges and oaths, and they renounced idolatry, meaning they promised to stop sheltering pagan Norse claimants to York. His father's submissions had been handshakes with individuals. This was starting to look like the machinery of a state. And the machinery is where this chapter lives, because Ethelstan's real genius was not conquest. It was administration, and you can watch it working in the documents his government left behind. Start with the royal meetings. Every king had a council. The Witan, the wise men. Traditionally, a warband's inner circle scaled up. Ethelstan turned it into something closer to a national assembly. And the proof is in the witness lists, 10th century charters, the documents recording royal grants of land. End with a list of everyone present who consented, ranked in order, and the lists from Ethelstan's assemblies are unlike anything seen before in Britain. A single grant of land might be witnessed by the archbishops of Canterbury and York together, a dozen bishops, English ealdormen from Wessex and Mercia, and then, in a line that would have been science fiction a generation earlier, a row of names like and Guthrum and Skule, Danish jarls of the Midlands and the North, sitting in an English king's council, consenting to an English king's business, alongside Welsh rulers whose names the English scribes spelled as best they could. Picture the room behind one of those witness lists. Men whose fathers had killed each other's fathers, Dane and Saxon and Welshman, gathered at a royal estate in Wiltshire or Kent, eating the king's food, hearing the king's law, signing the king's parchment. The Kingdom of England did not only exist on the coins, it existed in that room, in a seating chart, renewed assembly after assembly, year after year. Then the law, Aethelstan issued more legislation than any king before him, and the codes have a strange, modern texture because they are obsessed with enforcement. One code frets that theft is not being punished uniformly and orders the reeves of every shire to swear to apply the law equally or lose office. Another, remarkably, revisits an earlier statute because the king has concluded it was too harsh, raising the minimum age for the death penalty from 12 to 15. Because the code says, in nearly these words, the king thinks it cruel that such young people should be killed for small crimes, as he has seen happen. Stop on that clause. A 10th century government, reviewing its own sentencing policy on the grounds of cruelty to minors, and writing the reasoning into the statute. This is not a warlord's kingdom anymore. Somebody in this administration is thinking about justice as a system with feedback, and then the reach abroad. Because Aethelstan understood something none of his ancestors had the standing to attempt. Legitimacy compounds when foreigners recognize it. He became the marriage broker of Europe. And the roll call is astonishing. One sister married the Carolingian king of the West Franks. Another married Otto, the future emperor, the most powerful man in Germany. Others made matches into the great duchies of France and Burgundy. Foreign princes were sent to his court to be fostered. The future king of Norway among them, raised English at an English court, and exiled royalty washed up at his table, including his own nephew by marriage, a boy who would one day rule the Franks. The court that had been hiding in a Somerset swamp 2 generations earlier was now the finishing school of Western royalty, collecting relics, manuscripts, and dependents from half of Christendom. It is worth pausing on how strange and specific this achievement is, and one more audience should sit forward here. In August of 1776, in Philadelphia, a committee of 3 men, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, met to design a great seal for the brand new United States, and Jefferson made a proposal that Adams recorded in a letter home. The reverse of the seal, Jefferson suggested, should carry Hengist and Horsa, the legendary Saxon chiefs whose people, he said, had brought to Britain the political principles and form of government the new republic now claimed for itself. The proposal lost. The eagle won. But hold the moment for what it reveals. The founders of the American Republic, hunting for their political ancestry, reached past Parliament, past Magna Carta, all the way back to the world. This story is standing in to the assemblies and law codes and sworn free men of Anglo-Saxon England. The tradition they were pointing at, government by council, law above the sword, the shire and its court, is the tradition Aethelstan's clerks were writing down, one witness list at a time. 8.5 centuries before Philadelphia, Aethelstan wore the whole edifice lightly. By the standards of conquerors, he never married, fostered his young half-brothers as his heirs, and the tradition that reached the Norman historians 2 centuries later remembered him as pious, generous, and graceful, a collector of holy relics, a founder of churches, fair-haired, slight, much loved, friendly tradition, handle accordingly. But one detail no tradition needed to invent. For a decade, the system worked. The island was quiet. The coins said King of all Britain, and no one on the island was in a position to laugh. Beyond the island was another matter. In Dublin, a new generation of the North Sea dynasty was rebuilding its fleets and remembering York as stolen property. In Scotland, King Constantine had sworn at Aemont and spent every year since regretting it, watching this English colossus swell on his southern border, in Strathclyde, in the Isles, in every court that the coin legend insulted. The same conclusion was forming. Separately, none of them could touch him. Together, they might tear the whole thing down while it was still new. In the autumn of 937, they stopped being separate. The Armada came together in the Irish Sea in the sailing season of 937, and the sober version of its manifest is frightening enough without any poet's help. Olaf Guthfrithson, King of Dublin, Higher of the Dynasty Ethelstan had thrown out of York, with the war fleet of Norse Ireland at his back. Constantine, King of Scots, old and canny, the man who had knelt at Emont, now bringing the whole levy of Scotland to unkneel. Owain of Strathclyde, king of the last Welsh-speaking realm of the north, with his people beside them, 3 nations, 1 target, and one perfectly clear war aim. This was not a raid for plunder. It was a coalition assembled to break the new kingdom of England back into its pieces, to restore Norse York, unbolt the north, and reduce the House of Wessex to what it had been before the coins started boasting. They landed in force, most likely on the northwest coast, and drove inland, harrying as they came, forcing the crisis on their terms. And Ethelstan, the administrator king, the man of charters and coinage, gathered the thing his family had spent 3 generations building and marched north to meet them. The army that answered his summons was itself the argument, men of Wessex and men of Mercia marching in one host under one king, the 2 halves of the Weld, going north together to find out if the Weld would hold. What happened when the armies met is the most famous mystery in Anglo-Saxon history, and the mystery deserves to be stated plainly, because it is half the story. Nobody knows where Brunanburh is. The battle that confirmed England's existence has no confirmed address. More than 40 candidate sites have been argued across a century and a half of scholarship, from Scotland to Yorkshire to the Wirral Peninsula near Liverpool, where recent argument has leaned. And the truth is that the field where perhaps tens of thousands of men fought and thousands died has simply slipped off the map. England won its founding battle, and then, over the centuries, lost the battlefield. There will be no tidy tactical reconstruction in this chapter. No arrows on a diagram, because any such diagram would be an invention, and this story does not sell inventions as facts. Here is what the record does give, and it gives it in an extraordinary form. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the dry, tight-lipped ledger. This story has been quoting for 11 chapters. The source that recorded the near extinction at Chippenham in a couple of stony sentences, arrives at the year 937 and does something it had never done before. It stops keeping accounts, and it breaks into poetry, where the entry should be. Someone set down 73 lines of full-dress heroic verse, the oldest war poem in the English language, whose date we can fix, and the change of register is itself the loudest fact in the source. Whatever happened on that field hit the men who kept the national record so hard that prose could not hold it. Listen to what they wrote, in close paraphrase. In this year King Ethelstan, Lord of Earls, ring-giver of warriors, and his brother, the Atheling Edmund, won lifelong glory in battle around Brunanburh. They split the shield wall, hewed the linden boards with hammered blades. the sons of Edward, as was natural to men of their lineage, defending land, hoard, and homes against every foe. The enemy fell doomed. The field grew slick, the poem says. With the blood of men, from when the sun rose in the morning, glorious star, gliding over the earth, God's bright candle, until that noble creation sank to its rest. There, it goes on, lay many a warrior torn by spears, northern men shot over their shields, and Scotsmen too, weary, sated with war. Then the poem turns to the ledger of the enemy's grief, and the ledger is precise. 5 young kings lay stretched on that battlefield, put to sleep by swords, 7 of Olaf's earls beside them, and countless men of the fleet and the Scots. The Norse king was driven to the prow of his ship with a small remnant, shoving off over dark water to save his life. Old Constantine fled north to his own country, and the poem twists the knife by name. The hoary man of war had no cause to exult. He was shorn of his kinsmen, deprived of his friends, and left his own son dead on the slaughter field. Young, in war, behind them all, the poem says, the fleeing armies left the corpses to the black raven, the dark-coated eagle, the greedy warhawk, and that grey beast, the wolf in the wood, and then the poet reaches for the deepest measure of the day, the one that tells you what the men of 937 thought they had lived through. Never yet on this island. The poem ends. Was there a greater slaughter of people felled by the sword's edges? As books and old sages tell us, since Angles and Saxons first came here from the east, sought Britain over the broad sea, proud war-smiths who overcame the Britons and took the land, the keepers of England's record, hunting for a comparison, went back 500 years and found nothing. In their reckoning, the bloodiest day of the entire Viking age, worse than anything in the annals of the great heathen army, was the day the coalition tried to unmake England, strip the poetry back to consequence. And the consequence is stark. The coalition was not defeated. It was destroyed as a project. Olaf survived to reach Dublin. Constantine survived to reach Scotland, and neither survived as a threat. The alliance never reassembled. No Norse fleet, no Scottish army, no combination of the island's powers ever again in Ethelstan's lifetime challenged the existence of the United Kingdom. Notice what the victory did not do. It added not one field to English territory. The border stood where it had stood. What Brunanburh settled was a different kind of question, the kind that only gets asked once. Every enemy the new state had, all of them, together, at maximum strength, on ground of their choosing, had thrown themselves at the weld between Wessex and Mercia, between Saxon and Dane, between the old kingdoms and the new idea, and the weld had held. England could be invaded. It could not, by force, be unmade. Even the enemy's chroniclers filed the day under a title that concedes the point. The Irish Annals, written by no friend of the English, record the year with the entry, the great battle, lamentably and terrible, and for generations in the north. That was its name, the Great Battle. No location needed. Everyone knew. Ethelstan came home, struck his coins, held his assemblies, and had 2 years left. He died in October of 939, in his mid-40s, of no recorded violence, and even his burial broke the family pattern. He chose Malmesbury, an abbey he had loved, far from the dynastic vault at Winchester, and he went to his grave the way he had reigned, deliberately, singularly, alone. He had never married and left no son, a choice historians still argue over. And the succession he had groomed worked exactly as designed, the crown passing smoothly to his half-brother Edmund, the young atheling who had stood with him in the shield wall at Brunanburh, 18 years old, and already a veteran of the greatest battle in the island's memory. The founding generation's work was done, and the accounting was almost too clean. Alfred had saved the kingdom. Edward and Ethelfled had reconquered the land. Ethelstan had forged the state and broken its enemies in the field. What none of them had solved, what no one in the 10th century could solve, was the oldest problem in monarchy. The machine was magnificent, and the machine still needed one thing above all others to run: a grown, capable, living king. Within weeks of Ethelstan's death, the news reached Dublin, and Olaf Guthrythson, the beaten king of Brunanburh, began loading ships. He had lost the great battle. He had no intention of losing the peace that followed a dead enemy. The forge had made England. The next 15 years would test whether anyone could keep it lit. Ethelstan had been dead for a matter of weeks when the fleet from Dublin came over the horizon, and the speed of what happened next is the whole lesson. Olaf Guthrythson, the loser of Brunanburh, sailed into the Humber, and York, the city Ethelstan had annexed, ruled, and minted coins in for 12 years, opened its gates to him. No siege, no battle. The North simply changed its mind, and by 940, the coalition that had been destroyed on the great battlefield had recovered by other means everything it had lost there. York, the 5 boroughs of the Midlands, the whole northern half of the Weald, England, the permanent kingdom, the Rex Totius Britanniae on the silver pennies, had lasted precisely as long as the man who built it. The new king, Edmund, was 18 years old, and he spent his entire reign winning his brother's kingdom back. Give him this. He was good at it. He fought Olaf to a standstill, waited out the Norseman's death, then reconquered the 5 boroughs in a campaign the chronicles celebrated with another burst of verse, this one shorter and stranger than the Brunanburh poem, because of who it thanks: the Danes of the Midlands. It says, had long been bowed under the bondage of the heathen Norsemen, until King Edmund redeemed them. Read that again. The English record is describing Christian Danes, grandchildren of the great heathen army, as loyal subjects liberated by an English king from Viking oppression. 2 generations after Eddington, the settlers had become the settled, praying in English churches, sitting in English shire courts, and preferring an English king in Winchester to a pagan cousin from Dublin. The Weald was holding, after all, deeper down than anyone had measured. Edmund retook York in 944, held the whole inheritance for 2 years, and then, in May of 946, at a feast on St. Augustine's Day, the story took the kind of turn that no dynasty can plan against. In the hall at Pucklechurch, the king spotted a man named Leofa, a convicted thief he had personally exiled, sitting brazenly among the guests. Edmund, 25 years old, all instinct, went for him with his own hands. Leofa had a knife, the King of England, survivor of Brunanburh, conqueror of the 5 boroughs, bled out on the floor of his own feast over a matter of table security, and the crown passed to the last of the brothers. Edred was a sick man, so sick that the sources record he could barely keep food down, and he spent a decade dragging his failing body north again and again. Because York was not finished, the city had found one last Viking king, and he came with the best name in the entire saga age, Eric Bloodaxe, a son of the King of Norway, a man whose career had already included ruling and losing Norway itself. Eric was the final, magnificent, doomed edition of the old world. A sea king of the classic type in an island that had moved on. Twice York took him in. Twice the pressure of the English king and the ambitions of rival Norsemen threw him out. And in 954, the game ended the old way, betrayed by his own supporters as the price of their peace with Edred. Eric was ambushed and killed on the high moorland pass of Stainmore, on the road out of Yorkshire, the last Viking king of York dying in the heather with his retinue around him. Edred took the city back, and this time there was no next claimant, no fleet loading in Dublin, nothing. After 88 years, the line of kings that began when the great heathen army took York in 866 had run out of members. The Dane law, as a political fact, was over, and it had ended not with a treaty, but with an exhausted silence. What followed, once Edred's ruined stomach finally killed him, and a short, messy reign by a teenage nephew named Edwig had come and gone, was the payoff, the stretch of history that proves what the family had actually built. In 959, Edmund's second son, Edgar, came to the throne, 16 years old, and for as long as he ruled, which was 16 years, nothing happened. No invasion, no rebellion, no burned towns. The chroniclers, professional recorders of catastrophe, found themselves with almost nothing to write, and they gave him the plainest and most enviable epithet in the history of English kingship: Edgar the Peaceful. Peace, in the 10th century, was not weather. It was a product, manufactured by strength, and the sources are clear about the manufacturing. Edgar kept the fleets manned and the fortresses garrisoned, and one 12th century tradition claims he sailed a war fleet around the whole island every year, showing the flag in every sea. The claim is late and probably polished, but the underlying fact is not nobody tested Edgar, because everybody understood the result in advance. Inside that shell of quiet, the machine got its finest tuning, and one mechanism deserves a close look, because nothing else in Europe compared to it. Edgar's government reformed the coinage, and the reform worked like this. Only the king's coin was legal money, struck to a single national standard at dozens of licensed mints across the kingdom, from Devon to York. And then, roughly every 6 years, the design changed, and every coin in England was called in. You brought your old silver to the moneyer. He struck it into the new issue, and the crown took a cut for the service. Sit with what that system required and implied. It meant the government could reach every purse in the kingdom on a schedule. It meant a farmer in Yorkshire and a fishwife in Kent carried identical silver, stamped with the same king's face, renewed at the same drumbeat. It meant the state had a recurring revenue instrument that no other Western kingdom possessed, and a census of its own economy every few years as the silver flowed through the mints. Administrative historians, careful people, not given to gushing, describe late Anglo-Saxon England as the most sophisticated state apparatus in Europe west of Constantinople. And the recoinage is Exhibit 1. The grandchildren of the Marsh fugitives had built a kingdom that ran on paperwork and precision, so smoothly that the smoothness itself became invisible, which is the fate of all great administration. Edgar waited until 973, 14 years into the reign, to stage his coronation. And the delay was the point. He was crowned at Bath, in the shadow of the Roman ruins, at the age of 30, the canonical age of priesthood, in a ceremony designed by his archbishop, Dunstan, to consecrate not just a warlord, but an anointed, almost priestly king of a Christian nation. The service written for that day, the oaths, the anointing, the investiture, proved more durable than anything else in this story. Its direct descendant, recognizably the same liturgy, was performed in Westminster Abbey in the year 2023, broadcast to the world, for the coronation of King Charles III. When Americans watched that ceremony on their phones, they were watching, at 11 centuries distance, Dunstan's script for Edgar, and immediately after Bath came the scene the age remembered best. Edgar travelled to Chester, on the River Dee, and there, the chronicle records, 6 or 8 kings of the island, Scots, Cumbrians, Welsh, met him and pledged themselves, and a later, beloved tradition has them taking the oars of his barge and rowing the King of England down the river while he sat at the helm. The rowing may be embroidery. The submission is not. This is the summit, the highest the House of Wessex ever stood, an island ordered, at peace, and pulling in one direction. 2 years later, Edgar was dead at 32, without warning, and the floor at the centre of the whole design stood exposed in the space of a funeral. The machine was superb. The succession was not a machine at all. Edgar left 2 sons by 2 different women, a teenager named Edward and a small boy named Ethelred, half-brothers with rival mothers, rival faction, and rival claims, and the great men of the kingdom split over them while the churchmen scrambled to hold the centre. Edward, the elder, was crowned. His stepmother, Elfrith, Ethelred's mother, retired with her son to her estates, to a fortified residence in Dorset, at a place called Corfe, where the road from Wareham climbs through a gap in the Purbeck Hills. 3 years into the new reign, in March of 978, the young king went hunting in Dorset, and toward evening he turned his horse toward Corfe, to pay a family visit to his stepmother and his little half-brother. He rode up to the gate with a small escort, and the household came out to greet him with every courtesy, and someone held his bridle, and someone else offered the mounted king a cup of welcome. He never got down from the horse. The oldest account of what happened at Corfe on the evening of the 18th of March, 978, is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and for once the family's own record does not soften a syllable. This year, it says, King Edward was killed at the Gap of Corfe, and men murdered him. And the entry that follows rises into something close to a cry. No worse deed for the English race was done than this, since they first sought out the land of Britain. The fuller story, assembled from accounts written within a generation, runs like this. The king rode up at dusk, and was met at the gate by the household of his stepmother, welcoming, deferential, crowding around the horse. A cup was offered, and while the king drank, still mounted, hands took hold of him, and a blade went in. Edward spurred away, dying, lost the saddle, and was dragged with one foot caught in the stirrup until the horse ran itself out, and the body was recovered from a marsh and buried at Wareham in haste, without royal honours, as if the object were to make him disappear. He was about 16 years old. No one was ever punished. That sentence should be impossible, and it is the key to everything that followed. A crowned, anointed King of England was assassinated at the residence of his stepmother, in the presence of her household, to the direct and immediate benefit of her son, and the government of England conducted no inquiry, named no culprit, and executed no one. The new king was Ethelred, the little half-brother, roughly 12 years old, and the regime that formed around him was run by exactly the people the murder had served. His mother, Elfrith, foremost among them. Nothing in the surviving record proves her hand on the knife, and historians have argued the evidence both ways for 1,000 years. What nobody can argue away is the silence afterward, and the silence did its own damage. The dead boy's cult began almost at once. Miracles reported at the grave. The body translated with great ceremony a year later to the nunnery at Shaftesbury, pilgrims gathering, and within a generation the church was venerating Edward the Martyr while the throne was occupied by the brother whose people had killed him. The kingdom's conscience and the kingdom's crown had come apart, and every man in England who ever needed a reason to withhold his loyalty from Ethelred now had one ready-made, stamped with a halo. Ethelred grew up inside that shadow, and the famous nickname deserves to be corrected before it does any more harm. Later generations called him Ethelred the Unready, and the joke has misled the English-speaking world ever since, because the original word is not about preparation. His name, Ethelred, means noble counsel. The nickname, Unread, means no counsel, bad counsel, a pun with teeth. Ethelred no counsel, the well-advised one who was advised into ruin. The men who coined it were not saying the king failed to see trouble coming. They were saying that at every fork in the road, the men around this king steered him wrong, and the record of the reign reads like a long, grim proof of the pun, because the timing, as ever in this story, was merciless. In 980, 2 years into the boy king's reign, the coastal entries in the chronicle change character again. In a way, any reader of chapter 3 would recognize with a chill: Southampton sacked, Thanet ravaged, Cheshire raided. After a generation of Edgar's peace, the ships were back, and these were not the desperate freelancers of the old days. Across the North Sea, Denmark had become a centralized kingdom under Harold Bluetooth, a monarch with fortress systems and engineering works of his own, a state builder in his own right. If the name sounds oddly familiar, it should. 11 centuries later, engineers at Ericsson, designing a technology to unite different devices under one wireless standard, named it for the king who had united the different Danish realms under one crown. And the Bluetooth symbol on every phone on Earth is his monogram, the runes of Harold's initials bound together. History does not repeat, but it does end up in your pocket. Harold's Denmark, And after him, his harder son, Sween Forkbeard, could raise fleets that were national armies, professional, disciplined, and aimed, increasingly, at the richest prize in the northern world, the beautifully administered, superbly taxed, magnificently liquid Kingdom of England. The blow that set the pattern fell in August of 991 at Maldon in Essex, and it produced the last great war poem of the Anglo-Saxon world. A Viking fleet, 93 ships by the chronicles count, camped on a tidal island in the Blackwater estuary, linked to the mainland by a causeway that flooded at high tide. The local commander, the ealdorman Bertnoth, an old man, dull, white-haired, a veteran of decades of the kingdom's wars, drew up the Essex levies on the shore to contain them. What happened next survives in a poem written close enough to the event that it names individual farmers in the ranks. The tide fell, the causeway emerged, and 3 English champions held it easily against the whole Viking army, because the causeway was a killing ground where numbers meant nothing. So the Vikings asked, with elaborate courtesy, to be allowed across, to fight on even ground, and Byetnoth, for his overmode, the poet says, for his overconfidence, his too much heart, granted it. The word has been argued over ever since. Pride, chivalry, recklessness, or the cold calculation that a contained fleet would simply sail on and burn someone else's county. The Vikings crossed, formed up, and in the slaughter that followed, the old ealdorman went down, hewed at the shoulder as he cheered his men on. And around his body, the poem stages the scene that England chose to remember. The household men who could have run did not. An old retainer named Bertwald raised his shield over his dead lord and spoke the lines that generations of English schoolchildren would one day learn. Thought shall be the harder, heart the keener, courage the greater. As our strength lessens, here lies our Lord, all hewn down, the good man in the dust. They fought over the corpse until they joined it. That was the poetry. Now the policy. In the aftermath of Maldon, the government of England faced the old question. Fight a war of attrition against an enemy who chose every landing, or pay him to leave. And the councillors around Ethelred, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, chose payment, £10,000 of silver, raised by national taxation and delivered to the fleet. The Chronicle records it in one flat, disgusted line. And in that line, a word enters English history sideways. The Danes were paid gaffel, tribute, and the later ages would call these payments the Danegeld, the Dane money. It bought exactly what such payments always buy. The fleet left, and the news of the price travelled home with it, to every hall in Scandinavia, carrying the most dangerous message a rich country can broadcast. England pays. Here is the poisoned inheritance in its full shape, and it is the darkest irony this family's story ever produced. The tax system of Alfred and Edgar, the hiddage assessments, the shire courts, the mints, the recoinage machinery, the whole apparatus built across a century to defend the English, was the very thing that made the payments possible. No other kingdom in Europe could have assessed, collected, and delivered £10,000 of silver on a deadline. England could. Efficiently, repeatedly, and the Danes knew it, because the coins in the tribute chests were the finest in the West and every one of them advertised the fact the machine built to stop the Vikings had become the reason the Vikings kept coming. A national treasury with a broken lock. And the men steering the boy king had just taught the wolves, for the first time, exactly where the door was and exactly how much was inside. £10,000 was the opening price. It would not stay the opening price for long. The numbers tell the story of Ethelred's reign better than any chronicle. So start with the numbers, because they climb like a fever chart. £10,000 of silver in 991, 16,000 in 994, 24,000 in 1002, 36,000 in 1007, 48,000 in 1012. Each payment bought a departure. Each departure advertised the price, and each returning fleet came bigger, because word had gone around every fjord in Scandinavia that the English crown was the best-paying employer in the northern world. Archaeology has delivered the receipt, and it is one of the most damning artifacts in European history. There are more English silver pennies of Ethelred's reign in the museums and burial hoards of Scandinavia than have ever been found in England itself. The physical money of the English state, struck in English mints with the English king's face on it, migrated to Denmark and Sweden by the ton, and you can stand in Stockholm today and look at cases of it. The payroll of the wolves, stamped with the face of the sheep. The government was not idle, and honesty requires saying so. Ethelred's regime built fleets, reorganized defences, legislated furiously, and the machine still worked well enough to raise the very sums that were bleeding it. What the reign could not manufacture was the one commodity the 10th century had run on: trust. The rot showed at the top. Commanders defected mid-campaign or declined battle at the decisive hour. And one of them, an ealdorman named Edric, would earn a nickname that outlived every man he betrayed. The pattern repeated with such regularity that the chronicle entries begin to read like a bitter joke. The army gathered. The moment came, and then, through this leader or that, the effort collapsed. The machine's parts were sound. Its operators had stopped believing in each other, and a defense system, it turns out, is made of belief. Then, in the year 1002, Ethelred's government committed the act that turned a profitable racket into a war of annihilation. The king was told, or claimed to be told, of a Danish plot against his life, and on the 13th of November, St. Brice's Day, royal orders went out to kill the Danish men living in England. Not the armies, the residents, Mercian, settlers, mercenaries who had taken English service, people who had lived for years inside the kingdom's peace. The order was unenforceable in the old Dane law, where the population was Danish, but in the towns of the south it was carried out. And in 2008, archaeologists working ahead of construction at St. John's College, Oxford, found what that looked like: a mass grave, dozens of skeletons, young men, many bearing multiple blade wounds, some burned, tumbled together in a ditch. The bones align with a surviving royal charter in which Ethelred himself, with breathtaking calm, describes how the Danes of Oxford fled into a church for sanctuary, and how the townspeople burned the church down over their heads, and how the king now graciously funds its repair. Among the dead of that November, later, tradition claims, was a woman named Gunhild, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, The claim comes late and cannot be proven. What needs no proof is the sequence, because from 1003 onward, Sweyn's campaigns against England stop reading like extortion and start reading like punishment, systematic, personal, and aimed at the throne itself. For 10 years the kingdom was flogged. The chronicle entries of these years are a litany of burned towns: Exeter, Norwich, Thetford, Oxford itself, and through them moves the most harrowing single episode of the reign. In 1011, a Danish army took Canterbury and captured the Archbishop, Elfheya, the head of the English Church. They held him 7 months for a ransom of £3,000, and he refused, forbidding anyone to pay a penny for his life while the country starved under tribute. At an Easter feast in 1012, drunk on southern wine, his captors dragged him into their assembly and demanded the money again. And when he refused again, they pelted him with bones and ox skulls and beat him to death, one Dane finishing him, in what the sources call an act of mercy, with the back of an axe. Even Viking opinion recoiled, and the fleet's greatest commander, a warlord named Thorkel the Tall, was so disgusted that he changed sides, taking 45 ships into English service. The kingdom had reached the point where its defence depended on hiring the more squeamish of its attackers. Sweyn came for the crown itself in the summer of 1013, and what happened next was not a conquest so much as a landslide. He sailed up the Trent to Gainsborough, and the north, the old Danelaw, submitted immediately, not as victims, but as men choosing the competent option. Then the Midlands. Then, after resistance, London itself gave way. By Christmas, Ethelred had put his family on ships to Normandy, following his wife Emma to her brother's court. And the King of Denmark was the acknowledged King of England. The House of Wessex, which had ruled since before England existed, was suddenly a family of refugees. And the detail that matters most in this story is the address of their refuge, Normandy, the Duchy of the Northmen, founded a century earlier by Viking settlers who had done in France exactly what the Danelaw settlers had done in England: taken land, taken the language, taken the faith, and become a power. Ethelred had married Emma of Normandy years earlier, precisely to close Norman harbours to Viking fleets. Instead, the marriage had opened a door through which his half-Norman sons now walked into exile, and through which, half a century later, something would walk back. Then fortune threw the dice down the stairs. Sweyn, master of England, died at Gainsborough in February of 1014. 5 weeks into his reign, the Danish fleet proclaimed his son, a young commander named Knut. The English establishment, given a breath, chose instead to invite Ethelred back from Normandy, and the terms of the invitation are a document worth pausing on, because nothing like it survives from earlier English history. The councillors declared, the chronicle records, that no lord was dearer to them than their natural lord, if only he would govern more justly than he had before. Ethelred returned on conditions, promised reforms, and drove Knut's unprepared forces out of the country in a rare burst of energy. It was the last thing that went right. The final act belongs to the son, and the son deserved a better stage. Edmund, called Ironside, was everything 3 generations of decline had forgotten. Hard, fast, personally fearless, a throwback to Edward and Ethelstan. When Canute returned in 1015 with a war fleet and the ruthlessness of a man collecting an inheritance, Edmund fought him. And when King Ethelred finally died in London in April of 1016, worn out at about 50, the new king, Edmund, fought on, and the year that followed was the most furious of the whole age. 5 pitched battles in a single campaigning season. London held under siege and relieved. The Midlands crossed and recrossed. And England, that had spent 20 years failing to show up, suddenly fighting everywhere at once. Because at last there was a king worth showing up for. It ended in October at Assundoun in Essex, where the armies met head-on, and the battle turned. The Chronicle says, with weary familiarity, when the ealdorman Edric, the serial traitor, betrayed his king one final time and fled the field with his division. And the flower of England, the record says, was destroyed there. Even then Canute chose settlement over pursuit. The 2 young kings met on an island in the Severn and divided the kingdom as Alfred and Guthrum had once divided it. Edmund taking Wessex, Canute the north, each the other's designated heir. 6 weeks later, on the 30th of November, 1016, Edmund Ironside was dead. He was in his early 20s. The sources closest to the event say simply that he died. And after a year of 5 battles, exhaustion and wounds explain a great deal. Later writers, unable to accept it, invented assassins and lurid methods, label the inventions as inventions. The consequence needs no embroidery. Under the treaty, the survivor took everything, and at Christmas the men of London acknowledged Canute, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, great-grandson of the world the great heathen army came from, as king of all England, the thing the coalition of Brunanburh could not do with 3 nations, the thing Guthrum and Olaf and Eric Bloodaxe had died failing to do, was done. A Viking sat on the throne of Alfred, and the house of Wessex was a widow in Normandy, 2 boys in exile, and a grave at Glastonbury. And now watch closely, because what the conqueror did next is the strangest victory this family ever won. Snute's reign began with a purge, because that is how conquests begin. Edric the traitor, who had sold 2 English kings, came to collect his reward and received the only payment his career had ever truly earned. Canute had him killed within the year, by one account, with the observation that a man who had betrayed his last lord would betray this one, and the body thrown over the city wall. Hostages were mutilated, inconvenient nobles exiled or executed, the surviving sons of Edmund Ironside smuggled abroad, infants carried east to Hungary, beyond the reach of practical murder. A Danish army of occupation settled onto English estates, and in 1018 the new regime extracted the largest single payment of the entire era, £72,000 of silver for the army, plus 10,500 from London alone, the war's final invoice, delivered by the winners. Every conquered kingdom in history knows what comes next. The new elite imposes its language, its law, its gods, its friends. That is what conquest is for, and it is here, at the moment of total Danish victory, that the story of the House of Wessex produces its most unexpected chapter, because Canute, holding absolute power over a beaten country, looked at the machine his family had spent 2 centuries fighting, and instead of breaking it, he sat down at the controls. Follow what he actually did, item by item, because the list is the argument. He kept the shires, the ealdormen becoming earls, a Danish word on an English office, but the office itself, the shire courts, the reeves, the 100 assemblies, untouched and running. He kept the coinage system exactly as Edgar had designed it, the national mints, the periodic recoinage, the royal monopoly, striking his own face onto the machinery of English silver without altering a gear of it. He kept the church, endowed it lavishly, rebuilt what his father's armies had burned, and carried the relics of the murdered Archbishop Elfir to Canterbury with royal honours. A Viking king staging a state apology for a Viking crime. He married Emma of Normandy, Aethelred's widow, the most pointed continuity of all. The new king stepping into the old king's marriage bed to signal to England and to Normandy that nothing fundamental had changed. And in 1020, at Oxford, of all resonant places, his government issued a proclamation to the whole realm in which the King of Denmark promised the English, in their own language, that he would govern by the law of Edgar, the law of the Golden Age, the law of the house he had dispossessed. The conquered did not adopt the conqueror's system. The conqueror adopted theirs, and said so in writing. Understand why. Because it is the deepest compliment the Anglo-Saxon state ever received. Knut was not sentimental. He was the most powerful ruler the North had ever produced. King of England and Denmark. Later, of Norway too. Master of a sea empire that ringed the whale roads from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. He kept the English machine, because the English machine was, quite simply, the best instrument of government north of the Alps. A tax system, a court system, a mint system, a muster system, all of it running on parchment and habit, capable of delivering more silver, more reliably, than everything else in his empire combined. England was the crown jewel, not because of its fields, but because of its filing system. The wolves had finally gotten inside the house. And inside the house, they found the plumbing, so good they decided to live there and pay the maintenance. He grew into the part with a thoroughness that fooled no one and impressed everyone. He went to Rome in 1027, walking as a pilgrim to the coronation of the emperor, and sent home a letter addressed to all the people of England, describing how he had negotiated toll reductions for English pilgrims and merchants on the roads of Europe. The Viking conqueror, writing home like a diligent trade representative. The famous story of Knut and the waves belongs to this reign and needs its label. A century after his death, a chronicler recorded the tale, the king setting his throne on the shore and commanding the tide to halt, the tide ignoring him, and Knut turning to his flatterers to declare that the power of kings is empty breath beside the power of God. The story is late, unverifiable, and, note well, told in Knut's favour, a parable of humility, not arrogance. The detail everyone forgets is the ending. The king hanging his gold crown on a crucifix and never wearing it again, whether or not the shore scene ever happened. The man it describes, a ruler performing Christian kingship with total command of the theatre, is exactly the man the documents show. For nearly 20 years it worked, and England, bled white by the long catastrophe, was quiet. taxed, and safe. Guarded by the one navy, no Viking would challenge. Its old ruling house reduced to 2 exiled boys in Normandy learning French. Then, in 1035, Knut died at Shaftesbury, around 40 years old, and the empire that was held together by one man's competence did what such empires do. His sons proved the point of this whole story by inverting it. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, quarrelling half-brothers, ruled 7 years between them, taxed savagely, murdered a Wessex prince who ventured home, Alfred, Emma's younger son, by Ethelred, seized on arrival, blinded so brutally that he died of it. And then, one after the other, the Danish kings dropped dead young, Harthacnut collapsing at a wedding feast, drink in hand. In 1042, the Danish royal line in England was extinct. The Witan looked around for a king, and there was exactly one candidate left standing, the last living son of Ethelred and Emma, a quiet, pious man in his late 30s who had spent a quarter-century in Norman exile. The House of Wessex came home. Edward, whom history calls the Confessor, was crowned at Winchester in 1043, and on the surface the restoration was complete. Alfred's blood on Alfred's throne. The old line renewed. Look one layer down, and everything had changed. The new king spoke French as easily as English. His mother was Norman. His upbringing was Norman. His friends, his household priests, his instincts were Norman. And he salted his court and his church with Norman appointees who owed nothing to any English faction. He had returned to a kingdom whose real power no longer sat entirely with the crown. The earldoms Knut created had grown into vast private empires, and the greatest of them, Wessex itself, the family's own ancient heartland, belonged to a self-made dynasty of operators, Earl Godwin and his ferociously capable sons. The very family implicated in the betrayal and death of the king's own brother. Edward spent his reign in a long cold war with the Godwins, tried once to break them and failed, and settled into what he could control, the law courts, his prayers, and a colossal building project on an island in the Thames west of London. A great abbey church in the new continental style, the Westminster, the first Norman building in England, rising stone by stone as the rain ticked down, because the rain was ticking, and every court in northern Europe could hear it. Edward's marriage to Godwin's daughter produced no children, year after year after year, and a childless king in his 60s is not a government, he is a countdown. Around the empty cradle, the claimants gathered like weather fronts. Harold Godwinson, the old earl's son, the richest and most capable man in England, commander of its armies, king in everything but blood, Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last great Viking of the old stamp, with a legal claim spun from a treaty between dead kings and a battle-axe to enforce it, and across the Channel, the Duke of Normandy, William, Emma's great-nephew, a man who had survived a bastard's childhood and won an Iron Duchy, and who had convinced himself, on evidence historians still argue about, that his cousin Edward had promised him the English crown. On the 5th of January, 1066, in his new palace at Westminster, with the abbey consecrated just 8 days earlier. Edward the Confessor died, the last crowned king of the House of Wessex, and the countdown reached 0. Within 24 hours, England had a new king, crowned with unseemly speed in the brand new abbey. His name was Harold Godwinson, and in his veins ran not one drop of the blood of Alfred. The house that forged England had run out of kings. What happened to the kingdom next would prove. In 9 terrible months. Exactly what the family had built, and exactly what it had failed to build. Harold Godwinson was crowned on the 6th of January, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, within hours of Edward's funeral in the same building. The old king went into the floor in the morning, and the new king took the crown by afternoon. Mourners and coronation guests, being the same men in the same clothes on the same day. The speed was not in decent haste. It was a message sent to 2 foreign courts at once, that the throne was occupied and the matter closed. England's leading men had made a soldier's choice. The one candidate who was grown, capable, on the ground, and backed by the wealth of the greatest family in the land. Blood had lost the argument to competence, and everyone understood that the argument would now be resettled with fleets. In the spring, the sky joined the story. Around Easter, a light appeared that moved night by night through the constellations, trailing fire, visible across the whole of Europe, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it in words you can still read. Then was seen over all England such a sign in the heavens as no man ever saw before. Some said it was the star called Comet, which some men call the long-haired star. It was Halley's Comet, making its scheduled visit to a planet that did not know about schedules. And in every court from Norway to Normandy, men read it as the obvious thing. A torch held over a crown that was about to change heads. Astronomy takes no sides. It did not need to. 2 invasion fleets were already building. The first blow came from the past. In September, Harald Hardrada of Norway came out of the north with 300 ships, the last great figure of the world. This story began in a man who had fought from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Kin to the boy King Ethelstan had fostered at the English court 4 generations back, come to take by axe what treaties and bloodlines whispered was his. He landed in Yorkshire, crushed the northern earls in battle, and took the submission of York. And for a few days it was 866 again. A Norse army holding the north, the old nightmare running on the old track. Then it met the thing the nightmare had never planned for. King Harold came up the old Roman roads from the south with his household troops at a speed no one believed possible. 180 miles in under 5 days. And on the 25th of September, at a river crossing called Stamford Bridge, he fell on the Norwegian army, while half of it was lounging in the sun with its armour stowed in the ships. The fighting was long and terrible, and it ended in annihilation. Hardrada took an arrow in the throat and died in the wreck of his shield wall. And of the 300 ships that came, the survivors needed only 24 to carry everyone home. The Viking Age, 3 centuries of it, ended on that afternoon, on English ground, at the hands of an English king, 19 days before that same king's own destruction. Because while the army stood exhausted in Yorkshire, the wind in the Channel changed, and William of Normandy came ashore at Pevensey with the second invasion. Knights, horses, archers, and a papal banner, unopposed, onto an undefended coast, Harold did the only thing his nature contained. He turned his battered household troops around and marched them the length of England, gathering what he could, declining all advice to wait, to gather the full furred, to let the invader starve through the autumn. On the 14th of October, on a ridge north of Hastings, the last English army of the Old World locked its shields on the high ground, and the last battle began at 9 in the morning and lasted until dark, which by itself tells you how close it was. All day the Norman cavalry broke against the shield wall and failed, and the wall held, and held, and then, in the long afternoon, it did the one thing a shield wall cannot survive, believing the enemy broken, parts of it chased, and the Norman horse turned on the pursuers in the open, and the wall thinned, charge by charge, feint by feint, until at dusk the core of it stood around the king and the dragon banner of Wessex, and the core went down fighting. Harold died there with his brothers beside him, by tradition, with an arrow in the eye, by every account, under Norman blades at the end. And the hilltop where the housecarls made the last stand is called Battle to this day. Now comes the part of 1066 that the movies leave out, and it belongs in this story more than the arrow does. England did not surrender at Hastings. William held a battlefield and a corpse, nothing more, and the surviving leadership of the kingdom gathered in London and did the most House of Wessex thing imaginable. The Witan met and elected a king, and the king they elected was a boy of about 14, named Edgar the Etheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, great-great-grandson of Ethelred, the last male of the ancient line, born in distant Hungarian exile and brought home years earlier as insurance, for roughly 8 weeks, while William burned a ring of scorched country around London. England had an uncrowned boy, king of Alfred's blood, chosen by council in the old way, the machine reaching by pure reflex for the old dynasty. The moment the sword failed, the reflex could not put an army in the field. The bishops and earls calculated, submitted, and in December brought Edgar himself to William's camp to kneel. And on Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned in Westminster Abbey, in Edward's church, over Edward's grave, while his guards outside, mistaking the coronation shouts for a riot, set fire to the surrounding houses. The Chronicle's obituary for the man, written at his death by an Englishman who had lived under him, is one of the most extraordinary passages in the whole record, a subject's cold accounting of a conqueror. He was a very stern and violent man. It says, so that no one dared do anything against his will. He had castles built, and poor men terribly oppressed. The king was so very stark, and took from his subjects many a mark of gold and hundreds of pounds of silver, all of which he took, by weight and with great injustice, from his people, with little need for such a deed. Into avariture did he fall, and loved greediness above all. That is the defeated, filing their report on the winner, in their own language. In the book, Alfred started, and the book kept being written, in monastery after monastery, for nearly a century after Hastings, until the last entries trail off at Peterborough in the year 1154, in an England where, as one of those final entries says of the anarchy of its day, men said openly that Christ and his saints slept, and the boy king, who never wore the crown. Edgar the Atheling lived one of the strangest long lives of the Middle Ages, and it deserves its minute, because it is the actual last chapter of the dynasty. He rose against William twice, and was forgiven twice. His sister Margaret married the King of Scotland and became a saint, which means the blood of the House of Wessex flowed back into the royal line of Britain through her daughter, who married a Norman king. So that every English monarch from the 12th century to the present, including the one crowned on television in 2023, carries the blood of Alfred through a refugee princess. Edgar himself fought in Italy, took service in the emperor's lands at Constantinople, by one account, rode on the first crusade to Jerusalem, and came home to England to grow old on a quiet estate, the last male heir of Cerdics's line, dying in his 70s. Sometime after 1125, so completely at peace that no chronicler troubled to record the year, the place, or the grave, the family that had produced Alfred in a swamp and Ethelstan on his coins ended not with a battle, but with a country gentleman nobody bothered to bury famously. So finish the accounting, because the conquerors finished it for us. 20 years after Hastings, William ordered a survey of his new kingdom. Every shire, every hundred, every manor, every plough, team and mill and fish pond, who held what it was worth, what it owed. His clerks rode out and compiled it in a single winter, and the English, with their gift for naming, called the result Domesday Book, the book of the Day of Judgment, because there was no appeal from it. It survives, and it is the most complete portrait of any medieval society in existence. And here is the point of ending on it. The survey was possible for one reason only. The machine already existed. The shires the commissioners rode through were Alfred's and Egbert's shires. The 100 courts that answered their questions were the old assemblies. The hides they counted were the units of the Burgel Hidage. The sheriffs who compiled the returns held the office of the Shire Reeves, and the tax lists they worked from were the Danegeld assessments of Ethelred's miserable reign. William conquered England with Norman cavalry and governed it with Anglo-Saxon paperwork. He kept the sheriffs, kept the shires, kept the coinage, kept the writs, because nothing in Normandy, nothing in France, nothing anywhere in Western Europe came close. The crown had changed heads. The kingdom underneath it never changed shape. And that kingdom, the taxed, shired, chartered, single kingdom of England, was the House of Wessex, still running, under new management. The language went underground and won its war more slowly. For 300 years after Hastings, the kings of England spoke French. The courts pleaded in French. The castles and the poetry of power were French. English lived where power was not looking, in kitchens and fields and markets, in the mouths of the conquered, and it did what living languages do to dead conquests. It swallowed the French words for government and cooking and law, digested them, and came back up in the 1300s as the tongue of Parliament and Chaucer, and then of Shakespeare, and then of a book of common prayer and a translated Bible, and then it crossed an ocean in the holds of small ships. It named a town in Massachusetts after Boston in Lincolnshire, Botolph's Town, a market settlement under a Saxon saint's name, so that the city of the American Revolution carries an Anglo-Saxon address. It carried the office of sheriff into every county courthouse in the United States, where Americans still elect the shire reeve. 11 centuries after Egbert's clerks invented the job, and it carried itself, the language of Alfred's translation desk, into the Declaration of Independence, into 400 million native mouths, into the sentence you are hearing at this moment. You have been listening to the House of Wessex for this entire story. It is the only dynasty in history you can still hear. They held the throne for 237 years, from Egbert's homecoming to the boy who knelt at Christmas, and they lost it, the way every dynasty eventually loses everything, to biology and luck and a changed wind in the Channel. The Normans took the crown of Wessex, but they had to rule the England that Wessex had forged. With the shires Wessex drew. The silver Wessex standardized, the law Wessex wrote, and the language Wessex saved. And from that day to this, no one has ever ruled it any other way.